Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. I've been hiking for years, but Big Bend National Park was a place I'd always dreamed of exploring. The park is massive, stretching across West Texas into the Chihuahuan Desert, where jagged peaks, deep canyons, and open desert sprawl out as far as the eye can see. There's a certain kind of peace that comes with being alone in a place like that. Just you, the wilderness, and the unbroken quiet. I'm no stranger to hiking solo. In fact, I prefer it. The isolation, the challenge, the raw beauty of nature. There's nothing else quite like it. The morning I set off, the weather was perfect, as if nature itself was welcoming me. The sky was pale blue, dotted with faint clouds, and the sun had just begun to rise over the mountains. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that only comes with early mornings, and I felt a slight shiver run down my spine as I adjusted my pack. I had spent the past few weeks meticulously planning the trek, the best routes, where to camp, what gear to bring. This was going to be a 3-day hike, a chance to completely disconnect from the world. The quiet solitude was exactly what I needed. I parked at the trailhead, took a deep breath, and shouldered my pack. The weight of it was familiar, comforting even, and I set out on the trail, watching the sun stretch its rays over the jagged cliffs. The trail started out easy enough, winding gently through the desert scrub. The ground beneath my boots was dry, hard-packed dirt mixed with loose gravel, and the landscape around me was striking. Cactus, mesquite trees, and sparse shrubs scattered in the vast emptiness. The air smelled faintly of sagebrush and the dry earth. For the first few hours, the trail was mine alone. I didn't see a single soul. No hikers, no campers, no vehicles. It was just me and the wilderness. And honestly, it felt incredible. I settled into my rhythm. Step, breath, step, breath. The only sounds were the soft crunch of my boots on the trail, the occasional rustle of a lizard darting across the path, and the wind sweeping through the distant mountains. But after a while, the silence started to feel off. It wasn't the usual quiet of nature, where everything seems to be in its place. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something was wrong. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. I hadn't hiked this far in a while, and my mind could be playing tricks on me. I continued down the trail, the landscape changing gradually as the path started to climb higher into the hills. The rocks underfoot turned jagged, the brush thinner, the views more expansive. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. But the feeling of being watched, that only grew stronger. I brushed it off as paranoia. But then I heard it, soft and distant at first, but unmistakable. The sound of gravel crunching underfoot. I froze, my heart beating a little faster. My first instinct was to turn around and see if anyone was there. But when I did, there was nothing. Just the same empty trail stretching behind me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking it, but then came something else, something more unsettling. The faint, acrid scent of cigarette smoke. I wasn't close enough to see anything, but I could smell it, carried on the wind. It didn't belong out here. The air in the desert was clean and dry, and the only scents I should be getting were those of the earth, sagebrush, and the occasional blooming cactus. I looked around, but again, there was nothing. Still, I felt my skin crawl. I glanced back once more, half expecting to see someone standing just off the trail watching me from behind a rock. But the trail was empty. Just me in the endless desert. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though. The smoke smell lingered in the air as though someone had just walked past me and left it behind. But I couldn't see a soul. Nothing moved. No rustling of the brush, no birds taking off in the distance. Everything was too still. I forced myself to keep walking. The trail was narrow here, winding through a stretch of scrub and low, jagged rocks. It felt like I was walking deeper into the wilderness, further from any kind of civilization, and the feeling of isolation that should have been comforting instead made me uneasy. I couldn't help but glance behind me every few steps, but each time there was nothing there. Still, that nagging sensation of being followed wouldn't leave. By the time the sun began to dip low in the sky, I'd reached a narrow ridge. The trail here was particularly treacherous, narrow and exposed, with steep drops on either side. The wind was picking up, and it carried with it the chill of the desert night that was fast approaching. My breath came a little quicker, but I didn't mind. The view was breathtaking. I stood at the edge for a moment, taking in the panorama, the sprawling desert below, the rugged peaks on the horizon, the distant swaths of green marking the river valley. The sun was a deep orange now, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. It was the kind of beauty that takes your breath away. But as I started down the trail, something felt wrong. There was a heavy, oppressive silence that hung in the air, the kind that makes you feel like you're not supposed to be there. And that's when I saw them. 2 men. They emerged from around a sharp bend in the trail, blocking my path. They weren't dressed like hikers. Their clothes were ragged, worn, and dusty, too old, too dirty. Their faces were partially obscured by the shadows of the canyon walls, but their eyes were fixed on me, and they weren't moving. They were just standing there, watching. For a moment, I thought they were just lost hikers, maybe in need of help. But then one of them spoke, and his voice sent a chill down my spine. "You've got a nice pack," he said, his tone low and oddly calm. "Looks like you've got enough supplies to share." My stomach dropped. I glanced at my pack, the expensive gear I'd carefully chosen for this trip. The tension in the air was palpable now. I knew right away that something wasn't right. These men weren't lost. They weren't hikers. They were something else. The second man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked me over. I instinctively stepped back, my hand drifting to my trekking poles, the weight of them reassuring. My mind raced. There was no way out of here. I was on a narrow ledge with no place to hide, and the men were blocking the only way forward. Before I could react, the first man pulled something from his side. A knife. It gleamed in the dim light, its edge catching the last rays of the setting sun. My heart pounded in my chest. "Hand over your gear," the second man said. They'd been following me, watching me. My mind screamed at me to get away, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. Then, in a split second, my instincts took over. Without thinking, I slammed the end of my trekking pole into the first man's ribs, and he grunted, stumbling back. The second man lunged, the knife aimed at my chest. I swung the pole, catching him across the face. He staggered, blood pouring from his nose, but it was enough of a distraction for me to turn and run. My heart was hammering in my chest as I sprinted down the trail, twisting through the rocky terrain. The men were shouting behind me, their footsteps pounding the earth as they gave chase. The rocks beneath my feet were loose and treacherous, and I could hear one of them stumble, cursing as he fell behind. But the other man, he stayed close. I spotted a dry ravine just ahead, a deep cut in the earth surrounded by jagged rocks. Without thinking, I scrambled into it, trying to make myself as small as possible among the boulders. The sound of footsteps above me sent a jolt of panic through my body, but I stayed perfectly still. I could hear their voices now, muffled as they searched for me. I waited and waited. My body was stiff from the cold, my muscles aching, but I dared not move. For what felt like hours, I sat there in the dark, barely breathing, listening to the men above me. Their voices grew fainter, and eventually the sound of their footsteps faded completely. Finally, I let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. It was over. For now. Dawn was breaking when I finally crawled out of the ravine. My body was sore, scraped up from the rocks, and I felt like I had run a marathon. My heart was still pounding, the adrenaline slowly wearing off, but I knew I couldn't stop yet. I still had to get out of here. I stumbled back toward the trailhead, dragging my feet through the dirt. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a warm golden light across the desert. The landscape was beautiful in its quiet, empty way, but all I could think about was getting back to the parking lot. When I finally reached the trailhead, I collapsed onto a bench, my legs barely able to hold me up. I reported what had happened to the park rangers, and at first, they didn't seem to believe me. But when I told them about the two men, how they'd been stalking me, how they'd tried to rob me, they started taking me seriously. They radioed for backup, and a search was launched almost immediately. Within a day, the Rangers had tracked down the two men. It turned out they weren't hikers at all. They were criminals, with a history of assault and robbery. They had been targeting hikers for weeks, stealing gear and food, and now they had finally been caught. I never went back to Big Bend after that. The memory of those men, their eyes watching me, still lingers in my mind. I know I got lucky, and I'll never forget the feeling of being completely alone out there in the desert, with no one around for miles and no way to know if help would come in time. It was supposed to be just a regular sleepover, you know, one of those simple nights where everything is easy and fun. My three best friends, Lena, Sophia, and Kayla, and I were looking forward to it for weeks. It had been a hectic month of unpacking and settling in since my family moved into this house, so the idea of a stress-free weekend was exactly what we needed. The house itself wasn't huge, but it had that cozy, old-world charm that I really liked. It was a quiet, suburban neighborhood in Sacramento. Nothing fancy, just rows of similar homes, each with its own little quirks. I'd never thought much of the neighborhood, except that it seemed pretty safe and peaceful. That was until Mr. Larson, our neighbor, introduced himself. I still remember the first time I met him, when we were moving in. He seemed friendly enough, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. It wasn't anything overt, but his smile was a little too wide, a little too eager. My parents didn't think anything of it, but I kept getting the feeling he was watching me too closely. It was subtle at first, just that lingering look when you weren't paying attention. Anyway, back to the sleepover. We had spent the earlier part of the night eating junk food, chips, cookies, candy, and watching a random assortment of movies. Everything was going as planned, simple, easy, and carefree. The couch was piled with blankets and pillows, the TV cast a soft, flickering light over the room, and the sound of laughter echoed between us. The night felt endless in the best way, like we could keep talking forever. Every once in a while, someone would get up to grab more snacks, or we'd pause a movie to joke about how ridiculous it was. But then, around 10 p.m., the doorbell rang. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a delivery or maybe one of the neighbors trying to be friendly. But when I opened the door, standing there was Mr. Larson, the man who lived next door. I wasn't expecting him, and I immediately felt that familiar discomfort flood back into my chest. He was standing there, smiling just a little too much, his hands in his pockets. "Hi, Mia. I just wanted to check on you girls, make sure you're all right. You know, a little late, and it's a quiet neighborhood, so I thought I'd stop by. You never know, right?" I forced a smile, but I could feel my stomach churn. Something about the way he stood there, just a little too close to the door, something about his eyes. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't like it. "Oh, we're fine, thanks," I said quickly, trying to shut the door without being rude, but also trying to get him to leave. I kept the door open just enough for him to see my face, but not enough for him to come inside. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze flicking past me into the house. "You sure? I mean, I could come in, you know, just make sure everything's okay. I'm not doing anything, just keeping an eye out for you girls. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck, and I instinctively took a step back. It wasn't that I thought he was going to hurt us, but something about the way he said it felt off. Thanks, but no thanks, I replied, keeping the door firmly in place between us. We're all good, but I appreciate you checking in. For a moment, he just stood there, his smile faltering. Then, he glanced down at his shoes for a brief second before looking back up at me. There was a strange shift in his demeanor, like the friendliness had suddenly been replaced by something darker. His smile twisted, just a little, but enough for me to notice. You don't have to be rude, he muttered, almost under his breath, before he turned and walked away. The door clicked shut behind him, and I stood there for a moment, still holding the knob. I laughed it off as soon as I walked back into the living room, but even then, the tension lingered. My friends noticed my unease right away. What happened? Lena asked, looking up from her phone. Mr. Larson, I muttered. He just came by to check on us. Sophia raised an eyebrow. Did he try to come in? I nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Yeah, it was weird. Kayla, ever the pragmatist, shrugged. He probably just wanted to be friendly. No big deal. We kept watching movies, joking around. The clock ticked past midnight, and the atmosphere in the room began to shift. We'd all moved into the living room floor by then, blankets and pillows scattered around us in a messy pile. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning in the background, a soft, almost soothing sound that helped drown out the silence. At some point, everyone dozed off. The TV was still on, but I don't think anyone was really watching anymore. My eyes fluttered open and closed as I tried to find a comfortable spot on the floor. I could feel the edges of sleep pulling at me, but I wasn't ready to give in. The sound of my friends breathing, soft and steady, was the only thing I could hear, and I focused on that, trying to push away the unease that kept creeping up on me. Then, there it was. A faint tapping noise. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, maybe the wind or the trees brushing against the house, but then the tapping came again. It was soft at first, almost too quiet to be real. I held my breath, straining to hear. Tap. I looked around, but no one else had stirred. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an insect or something. But then it came again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. My heart jumped and I froze, listening harder. The noise wasn't coming from the windows. It was coming from the patio door. My throat went dry. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore it. I felt a slow panic rising in my chest, and my eyes darted to the curtain covering the sliding glass door. The shadows outside the glass were thick like ink, and I couldn't see a thing. But the tapping continued, almost as if whoever was on the other side was testing the door, like they were trying to get in. I slowly pushed myself from the floor, careful not to make a sound. I could hear Lena breathing softly next to me, completely unaware of what I was hearing. The rest of the room was still and quiet, the only movement the occasional flicker from the TV. I stepped closer to the curtain, heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, sharper. Then, the sound changed. The handle rattled, my breath caught. That was enough to make me freeze. "He's back," I whispered, barely managing to get the words out. Lena sat up abruptly, her eyes wide with confusion. "What?" "Mr. Larson," I said, my voice trembling. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the door, from the shadow outside. "He's here." Her eyes went wide and she scrambled to her feet. "Oh, God!" The rattling of the handle continued, a slow, methodical sound, like whoever was on the other side was testing the strength of the door, trying to force it open. Panic surged through me. I turned, my legs like lead, and looked at the others. Kayla was already grabbing her phone. 911, she whispered urgently, her voice low and shaky. Sophia, still half asleep, was starting to stir, but she didn't fully understand yet. The door rattled again, harder this time, and then, bang! I almost screamed. The entire door seemed to shake with the force of it. A sickening realization hit me like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just knocking. He was trying to get in. The noise was deafening. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The door shook again with another violent thud. The glass creaked ominously, as if the weight of Mr. Larson's persistence was enough to force it off its hinges. I knew I had to do something, but my mind was a fog of fear. I turned to the others, who were now fully awake and wide-eyed. Kayla's hands were trembling as she held her phone to her ear, whispering urgently to the 911 operator. But there was no time to explain, no time to wonder what was happening or why. Lena's voice was sharp and quick. "What do we do? We can't just sit here." I didn't know. I didn't have any answers. All I could hear was the sound of Mr. Larson's desperation on the other side of that door. The room was thick with tension. We were all frozen for a few seconds, unsure of what to do. I had never expected this, never imagined that a simple sleepover would turn into something so terrifying. But there was no more time to think. I grabbed the lamp from the table and held it tight, my knuckles turning white as I braced for whatever was coming. We all stared at the door, our eyes fixed on the thin veil of curtains that separated us from whatever nightmare was outside. Another bang. And then the sound of glass cracking, like a spiderweb spreading across the patio door. The entire house seemed to tremble with the impact. I could hear the distinct sound of glass breaking, sharp and violent, and I felt a rush of cold air as the door's frame gave way. And then I saw it. Through the cracks in the glass, I saw him, Mr. Larson, his face pressed against the window, his eyes wide and wild, staring straight into the living room. His grin, twisted and manic, sent a shock of pure terror through me. I felt like I couldn't move, like my body was locked in place by the sheer horror of it. But then, before I could react, there was another shatter as his hand slammed into the window, and more glass fell to the floor. He was coming through. He was getting in. "Move!" I heard Kayla scream, and that broke the paralysis. Lena lunged forward, swinging the fireplace poker like it was an extension of her own arm, aiming for the jagged opening in the broken window. The sharp tip of the poker collided with the frame with a sickening crack that seemed to reverberate throughout the house. Mr. Larson recoiled, stepping back as if stunned. I saw him stagger for a moment, his wide eyes darting back to Lena. His face was no longer a friendly neighbor's. He was unrecognizable. For a second, there was a pause. I don't know if it was the shock of being hit or the sudden appearance of the police lights flickering through the yard, but Mr. Larson hesitated. That hesitation was enough. From outside, we heard the sirens blaring closer, growing louder. The familiar red and blue lights painted the walls of the living room in eerie hues. They were coming. But that didn't stop him. He took a step forward, his body half through the broken window, as though he didn't care that the glass shards were cutting into him. His fingers reached for the opening, his expression still wide-eyed and crazed. I didn't think. I just acted. Without thinking, I ran forward, slamming the lamp into his shoulder with everything I had. The impact sent a shock through my arms, and I felt the weight of the lamp's porcelain base crash against his skin. He reeled back for a second, his eyes widening in fury, and that's when we heard the police officers' voices booming from outside. "Freeze! Step away from the door!" they shouted, their voices sharp and commanding. Mr. Larson froze, his body rigid as he turned his head slowly toward the approaching officers. His hand had just barely made it through the broken window, but the sight of the police seemed to break whatever grip he had on his twisted intentions. With a sudden movement, he bolted, running as fast as his legs would carry him. He turned and disappeared into the dark yard, darting between the trees, his movements erratic. The sirens were louder now, the officers in pursuit, shouting orders. Within seconds, I heard the unmistakable sound of police radios crackling, and then a final command. "We've got him." The next few minutes were a blur. We stood there, our breath shaky, listening to the sound of the officers' voices and the distant, muffled sounds of Mr. Cafe, Larson, being apprehended. It didn't take long for the police to come inside and check on us. They told us that they had found him a block away, still trying to run. They quickly cuffed him and took him into custody. My body felt numb as I processed everything that had just happened. He had been stalking us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The police found duct tape, a rope, and a knife in his jacket when they searched him. He had everything planned, as if he expected us to let our guard down. The rest of the night passed in a haze. The police stayed for a while to take statements, but eventually they left. The house was quiet again, too quiet. My friends and I stayed up for a long time after they left, too shaken to sleep. When my parents returned the next morning, they were horrified. The police had filled them in on everything, and even though I told them we were fine, they were still scared for us. They promised they'd look into more security. And Mr. Larson, he was arrested for attempted burglary and stalking. The police said he was planning to take us, but thankfully, we stopped him just in time. It was a quiet Thursday night in late September, the kind of evening where the air feels crisp enough to wear a jacket, but not so cold that it feels uncomfortable. A soft breeze stirred the dry leaves on the ground, and I remember feeling this strange sense of stillness hanging over everything. Maybe it was because it was so late, almost midnight, and most of the complex was asleep. The world around me seemed to be on pause. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it feels like the whole night was leading up to that moment. I live in a small, almost forgettable apartment complex on the outskirts of town. It's one of those places that looks like it could use a fresh coat of paint, with cracked pavement in the parking lot and dim, flickering lights on every building. It's quiet, which I guess is nice. My apartment is on the second floor of one of the low-rise buildings. The laundry room is located at the back of the complex, past the last row of parking spaces. It's a small, nondescript building that always looks like it's been there a lot longer than it actually has. It's the kind of place you only go to when you absolutely have to. And at 11:30 p.m., I didn't feel like waiting until morning. I had worked late and wanted to get the laundry over with. I wasn't tired yet, and the laundry room was usually empty at this time, so it felt like a good opportunity to get it done without waiting around. I grabbed my basket and made the short walk from my building to the laundry room. It was cool outside. The breeze felt nice against my face. The parking lot was almost deserted. A few cars were scattered here and there, parked under the dim streetlights. It's one of those places where you're used to seeing the same cars night after night, the same old sedans and trucks. I put my clothes in the washer and then slipped my headphones in. I wasn't in the mood to just stand there and stare at the machines. Instead, I decided to put on a podcast. The voices from the speakers made me feel less alone in the cold, sterile space of the laundry room. I let the monotony of folding clothes take over, trying not to let my mind wander too far. The sound of the podcast, muffled by the soft thrum of the washing machines, was comforting. After about 20 minutes, I finished loading my clothes into the dryer. I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night felt a little warmer now, as though the breeze was trying to push back the coolness of the evening. As I walked toward the exit, I couldn't help but glance at the parking lot again. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The usual cars were parked in their spaces, some with their headlights off, others still lit. But then something caught my eye. At the very far edge of the lot, under the flickering street lamp, there was a dark blue sedan that I didn't recognize. I had never seen it parked there before. It was sitting in a space that didn't really have anything around it, just a patch of cracked asphalt and an old, overgrown hedge that ran along the perimeter of the complex. The car was too still. The engine was off, and the windows were rolled down just enough to let in the night air. At first, I thought it was nothing. It's not unusual to see a car parked in the lot, especially late at night. But then I noticed something. There was someone sitting inside. I didn't see their face, not at first. It was hard to make out any details through the tinted windows, but I could see the silhouette of a person slouched in the driver's seat. They weren't moving. Their posture was unnervingly still. It was like they were deliberately hiding in the car, watching. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just another person waiting for someone. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they had pulled over to rest for a bit. But then I saw the figure shift slightly, just enough for me to notice. Their head turned in my direction. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their gaze. I finished up quickly, grabbed my clothes, and walked briskly back toward my building. My mind was racing, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The parking lot seemed quieter than usual. The only sound I could hear was the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the distant rustle of leaves in the trees. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of an engine starting behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't turn around immediately, but I could feel the car moving. Slowly, deliberately. The engine hummed softly, and I could hear the faintest sound of tires rolling over the pavement. I couldn't help it. I glanced back over my shoulder. The dark blue sedan was creeping down the lot, moving at a snail's pace, headlights off. The figure inside, whoever they were, wasn't making any attempt to hide. It felt deliberate, like they were following me, watching my every step. I couldn't tell for sure, but I knew that if I didn't act quickly, I was going to be in trouble. I picked up my pace, trying not to break into a run. The complex was eerily quiet. There was no one around. No one in sight, no sounds of anyone coming or going, just the steady hum of the engine behind me. By the time I reached my building, I was almost out of breath. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for my keys. I glanced back again. The car had stopped, parked just a few spaces down from where I had entered the building. I hurried inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked the deadbolt and pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the car. Why had he been watching me? What did he want? I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering as quietly as I could. I think someone's following me. I don't know what to do. He's in the parking lot. The operator on the other end asked for my address and details. I gave them as quickly as I could, my words tumbling out in a rush. But as I spoke, I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps just outside my door. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. I could hear them getting closer, and then they stopped. The sound of a doorknob jiggled softly. My heart raced and I held my breath. There was no way he could have followed me inside. Was there? But after a while I heard something else. Footsteps, fading away down the hallway. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens blaring in the distance. I could hear their footsteps as they walked up the stairwell, their radios crackling in the otherwise silent building. They knocked on my door, asking me to open up. I could barely speak, but I unlocked the door and let them in. They asked me to describe everything that had happened, and I did. Everything from the car in the parking lot to the footsteps outside my door. The officers seemed to be taking the situation seriously. They immediately started searching the area. I could hear their voices in the hallway, faint but growing clearer as they moved toward the back of the building. They paused, then I heard one of them call out, "We've got him!" A few moments later, they returned with a man in tow, handcuffed and looking disoriented. He was thin, pale, with dark hair and a scruffy beard. The police had found him crouching near a back patio, hidden in the shadows. They searched his jacket and found a knife, a pair of gloves, and some other tools. It turned out he'd been stalking the complex for weeks, watching the residents and learning their routines. He'd followed several women home, waiting for the right moment to strike. My heart dropped as I realized that I might have been his next target. But somehow, I had caught on before it was too late. My quick thinking, my decision to call the police, had probably saved me, and maybe others too. The man was arrested and taken away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse. I later learned that several other residents had reported strange sightings, cars parked late at night, figures lurking in the shadows, but no one had ever put the pieces together until that night. I never did laundry at night again. I couldn't help but wonder how many other people he had been watching, how many others he had been following, just like he followed me. It was one of those oppressive summer evenings in rural East Texas, the kind that hangs heavy in the air. I had just finished dinner, a simple meal of canned beans and cornbread, and was sitting on my porch, rocking slowly in my old wooden chair. I loved it here, though, in the quiet of the country. I had inherited this old farmhouse from my grandfather, who had worked the land before me. It was a modest home, worn and weathered by the years, but it was mine. The land stretched out for acres, fields of corn rising up like a green ocean, so vast that on certain mornings you couldn't even see the end. My dog, Scout, was curled up at my feet, a golden retriever with a thick coat of fur that shed relentlessly in the summer. He usually kept to himself, enjoying the evenings in peace, just like me. But tonight was different. I first noticed Scout's behavior when he suddenly stood up, his body rigid and tense. He began barking, the sharp, frantic barks of a dog that had spotted something out of the ordinary. I looked over at him, frowning. He was staring intently toward the cornfield, his ears perked up, and his tail was held high. At first, I figured he had seen a coyote, or maybe a deer. There were plenty of wild animals around here, especially in the evenings. But his barking didn't sound right. It wasn't the normal alertness he used when spotting a critter. This was urgent, desperate, like something was wrong. "Scout," I called softly, hoping to calm him down. But he didn't stop. Instead, his barking became more frantic. Something was wrong. I stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my back as I stretched. The evening air was warm against my skin, but it did nothing to ease the sense of unease that was creeping up my spine. My eyes followed Scout's stare, but the field in front of me looked unchanged, stretching out under the slowly fading light. The corn stalks were tall, towering high above my head, nearly 8 feet, and they swayed gently in the wind, creating a sea of rustling noise. The space between each row of corn was narrow, and the maze-like field seemed to stretch on endlessly. I grabbed the flashlight from the porch railing, not thinking much of it, just a reflexive action, and stepped toward the yard gate that separated the house from the field. Scout was already darting toward the corn, barking more insistently now, his paws kicking up dirt as he ran. "Scout!" I called again, but he didn't stop. He was charging toward the field, like he knew something I didn't. My heart pounded in my chest as I reluctantly followed him. My boots crunched the dry gravel underfoot as I made my way through the yard. The further I walked, the quieter it got. The hum of insects died down, and even the wind seemed to hush in the distance. As I reached the edge of the field, the tall stalks of corn towered in front of me, blocking my view of anything beyond. My flashlight barely cut through the growing darkness, but it was enough for me to see the first row of corn stretching high into the night. "Scout!" I shouted, but there was no reply, just his frantic bark somewhere deeper in the rows. My boots sunk slightly into the muddy earth as I moved, each step adding weight to the pit forming in my stomach. I moved deeper into the field, my eyes scanning the surroundings. The corn was dense, so thick that it felt like I was walking through a tunnel. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, followed by the scrape of metal against metal. It was unmistakable. My eyes narrowed as I followed the sound, each step making the corn rows shift and sway around me. Something wasn't right. I had heard that sound before. Someone was tampering with my irrigation equipment. I had a few hundred yards of metal pipes scattered through the fields, and with how dry it had been this year, it was the only way to keep the crops from withering. I moved a little faster, the adrenaline kicking in, trying to move soundlessly despite the crunch of my boots in the mud. There, just ahead of me, I saw a figure crouching beside one of the irrigation pipes. A person, their face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, fumbling with the metal equipment. That's when I knew. They were stealing my irrigation parts. I had to act fast. My heart was racing now, but I still wasn't sure if I was angry or afraid. I wasn't expecting this. Not at all. Hey, what the hell are you doing? The figure froze for a moment, not turning toward me, not even acknowledging my presence. But then they slowly stood up, the rustling of corn behind them as they moved, and that's when everything went wrong. A flash of movement behind me, something heavy and solid, whipped out of nowhere. I didn't even have time to react before the impact came, a sharp pain slamming into the side of my head. I saw stars for a split second, and then everything went black. When I came to, everything was wrong. I felt the cold, muddy ground beneath me. My head was throbbing like someone was pounding a hammer against my skull. The light from the shattered flashlight was flickering weakly beside me. I lifted a hand to my head and the sticky warmth of blood met my fingers. I had been knocked out. I could hear Scout's whimpering nearby, a soft, mournful sound. "Scout!" I croaked, my voice barely audible. My throat felt dry. I tried to sit up, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The world around me spun in circles, my vision blurred in and out, and I had to steady myself. I finally managed to pull myself upright, leaning against the rough stalks of corn, steady. Every step felt like it took everything out of me, but I had to move, had to get back to the house. I couldn't stay here. "Scout," I murmured, stumbling forward toward his whimpers. My flashlight was dead. I knew I couldn't rely on it. The cornfield was thick and dark. The night air was thick and pressing against my lungs as I fumbled through the rows, barely keeping my balance. I could hear the rustling all around me, the wind picking up the movement of the corn, but nothing else. No footsteps. No voices. Just the faint sounds of Scout's cries. Somehow I managed to stagger to the edge of the field. I could see the faint outline of the farmhouse through the trees in the distance. It felt like a lifetime before I finally crossed the yard and reached the porch. I didn't even stop to sit down. I immediately pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The police arrived shortly after. The sheriff's deputies were professional, kind even. They asked questions, and I told them everything I could. I didn't have much to offer, though. I had barely caught a glimpse of the person before everything went black. Just a shadow, a figure, tall and slim, wearing dark clothes, but that was all. "Do you remember anything else about them?" one of the deputies asked, scribbling on a notepad. "No, just the boots," I muttered, my voice hoarse. "Heavy boots, and they were looking at the pipes, trying to steal them." The deputies took my statement and promised to investigate. They began searching the cornfield that night, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices calling out in the night. But the search felt hopeless. The field was too dense, the rows too tight. They found a few signs of forced entry, a small break in the fence, and some scattered footprints, but nothing solid. They didn't find anything that night that could lead to an arrest. No one was caught. The sheriff promised to keep investigating. I spent the rest of the night in the hospital, getting stitched up and patched together. The doctor told me I was lucky, a little closer, and the blow could have been fatal. When I finally got home, the house felt eerily quiet. I locked all the doors, checked the windows, and made sure everything was secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept glancing at the cornfield, the vast emptiness beyond the fence. The silence in the air was oppressive, heavy, and I couldn't help but wonder, was the person still out there, waiting in the dark? I never planned on moving into a house with a basement. Actually, I never thought about it at all. The whole concept seemed like something that belonged in an old movie or maybe in the kind of suburban neighborhood that still felt stuck in the 80s. But when I found this place, tucked away in the hills just outside Los Angeles, it was different. It wasn't the sleek modern loft I thought I wanted, but it had a kind of charm that pulled me in. The house was old, maybe early 1900s, with creaky floors and windows that groaned when the wind hit them just right. The hardwood was worn and scratched, the kind of floors you can only get by walking across them for decades. The walls were a dull yellow, like someone had tried to make it sunny, but it ended up just being faded and tired. I liked it, though. It felt lived in. It felt real. I was 28, just coming off a long stretch of renting a place with roommates who never cleaned, and I was ready to finally live on my own. I worked a 9-to-5 job at a marketing agency. My life was simple. I'd wake up at 7 a.m., throw on something semi-professional, grab a coffee, and spend the day in front of a computer screen. There wasn't much excitement. No pets, no relationships, just me and the quiet hum of the city outside my apartment window. That's what I thought I wanted. Stability. Calm. When I saw the house, though, something shifted. It was exactly the kind of place I imagined settling into. It had a garden out front with an old oak tree that looked like it had been there for generations. The backyard had a small cobblestone patio that seemed perfect for barbecues. The only downside? The basement. It wasn't anything too scary at first glance. It was just a room tucked under the house. It didn't even have windows. The door was at the base of the kitchen, and the stairs led down into darkness. The light switch for the basement was down there too, which I thought was strange, but it was such a minor detail, I didn't think about it much. The realtor, a woman named Janet, pointed it out casually as we toured the house. She had that perfect real estate agent smile, always a little too bright. "It's a good space for storage," she said. "Maybe for old furniture or your holiday decorations. You won't even know it's there once you close the door." I nodded, but something about the idea of having a basement in a house so old made me uneasy. I didn't think much of it, though. I was too caught up in the excitement of finally owning my own place. It wasn't until a couple of weeks after I moved in that I first noticed the light. It was around 8 p.m. one evening. I'd just finished unpacking a few more boxes in the living room and had decided to make some dinner. My new kitchen had a nice, old-fashioned feel to it, with deep blue cabinets and black and white checkered floors. I felt comfortable there. Peaceful. I set the pot on the stove, and as I reached for the garlic, something caught my eye. The basement light, dim and yellow, like an old bulb, that was on. At first, I just stared at it for a second. I had no memory of turning it on, but it wasn't exactly unusual. It could have been something I did earlier in the day and just forgot. My mind was still preoccupied with settling in. The kitchen was my focus, not the basement. I shrugged it off, finished cooking, and went to bed. But the next night, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch with a book, the sounds of the house creaking around me, when I glanced over at the kitchen door. There it was, the light in the basement, on once again. I stood up, feeling a little frustrated with myself. "I must be forgetting," I muttered aloud, like talking to myself would somehow make it better. I went into the kitchen, made sure the light was off, and went to bed. But even after I turned out the lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it. The basement's light. It felt wrong. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and getting used to my new life. Work was stressful as always, but there was a comfort in being home at night, away from the office noise. I went to bed early and woke up early, finding a rhythm to this new chapter of my life. But every time I passed the basement door, a small voice in my head nagged me. Why is the light on? It started happening more frequently now, and each time it felt a little stranger. I began to notice how quiet the house was when the lights went out at night. There was no hum of traffic outside, like there had been in my old apartment. No voices in the distance, just silence. It wasn't an eerie silence, necessarily, but there was something unsettling about it. Almost like the house was waiting for something. One night, a week after I first noticed the light, I went into the basement to investigate. It wasn't like I had to go down there. It wasn't urgent or anything. But I'd been thinking about it too much, and I wanted to finally figure out what was going on. I stood at the top of the stairs and glanced down. The light was on, but it was dimmer than usual, the bulb flickering as though it were struggling to stay lit. My breath caught for a moment. It was strange how something so ordinary could feel so wrong. I reached for the door handle and pulled it open. The smell of old wood and mildew hit me immediately. The basement was cooler than the rest of the house, and the air felt thick as if it were holding its breath. I didn't like it. The stairs were steep and narrow, and they creaked as I descended. At the bottom, the floor was a concrete slab, uneven and rough. There were boxes stacked in the corners, some I recognized from my move, others I couldn't remember ever packing. The basement smelled damp, musty. I flicked the light switch and the room blinked to full brightness, but it didn't make me feel any better. I turned to head back up, but then it happened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. For a split second, I felt something. I can't explain it. Maybe it was my imagination, but I felt watched, like someone was standing in the shadows just outside the light. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The only thing in there besides the boxes were some old shelves, covered in dust and cobwebs. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I turned off the light and hurried back upstairs, the silence of the house closing in around me. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. There was just something about that basement. It felt like it was too quiet, too still, like something was hiding just below the surface. The next few days felt off. There were little things, like the sound of something dragging across the floor when I knew I was alone, or the time I was in the shower and felt like someone was standing in the doorway just out of view. But nothing compared to what happened one night. It was a Friday, and I was exhausted from a long week at work. I was trying to unwind by watching some Netflix, but my mind kept drifting. Every time I glanced over at the kitchen doorway, I saw it. The light in the basement. It was on again. I tried to convince myself I wasn't being ridiculous. It was probably just a coincidence, right? I didn't leave it on. It wasn't even like I was trying to find something strange. But that's when I felt it. That same heavy presence that lingered in the basement, the feeling of someone standing in the dark, watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, switched on the flashlight app, and marched toward the basement door. My hands were shaking slightly, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I opened the door. The light was dim, flickering in the corner, and I stepped down the stairs. The air was cold. I felt my breath catch, but I didn't stop. I needed to get to the bottom of this. When I reached the last step, the light went out. The darkness consumed me. My flashlight didn't help much, just a small circle of light in the otherwise pitch black space. And then I saw it, just at the edge of the circle. A shadow. It moved, I couldn't even breathe for a moment, standing frozen, staring at it. The light flickered back on, and in that split second, I saw it clearly. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still at the farthest corner of the room. And before I could react, the light went out again. I rushed up the stairs, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my breath, heavy and ragged. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, trembling, and called the police. I didn't know what else to do. Something in that basement was wrong, and I had to know what it was. It felt like forever before the two officers arrived. They were kind, one younger than the other, probably in his early 20s, and the older officer just looked tired. I explained what had been happening, the flickering light, the feeling of being watched, the shadow I saw in the basement. The younger officer offered a smile. "We'll take a look," he said. They both made their way down into the basement with flashlights in hand. I stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the shadows below. I could barely breathe as they moved around the room, their flashlights casting strange shapes against the walls. When they returned, the older officer looked at me with a raised brow. "Nothing down there," he said. "No signs of forced entry, no one hiding. The light switch probably just malfunctioned. It happens. Your mind might have played tricks on you with the flickering light." The younger officer gave me a nod. "Yeah, it's easy to get spooked in a dark place like that. I wouldn't worry about it." I felt a wave of frustration and relief. They didn't get it. They didn't feel what I felt down there. But I thanked them anyway, grateful for their reassurance, even though I knew deep down that something still wasn't right. They left, and I locked the door to the basement behind them. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were wrong. But that light, no matter how many times I checked, always flickered on at night. It always pulled me in, beckoning, making my heart race. But I refused to go down again. I stayed away, locked the door, and never looked back. The basement stayed just as it was, dark, empty, and waiting. And I just try to forget that feeling, that thing, down there in the quiet dark, watching, waiting for me to come back. And now, I can't seem to stop hearing the whispers. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear the creak of the stairs. Just a little sound, nothing I can place. But I know what it is. It's waiting. I still can't shake the feeling that something's not right whenever I think about that night. But let me start from the beginning. My name's Jack Morrison. I'm 22 years old, and I'm the kind of guy who enjoys spending time alone in nature. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved the outdoors. My friends don't get it. They like the idea of camping, but they'd rather do it at a crowded site with fire pits and people nearby. Me, I like the solitude, the deep quiet of the forest, the cool mountain air, the thrill of hiking miles and miles without another soul in sight. That's exactly why I decided to take a solo camping trip to Davis Mountains State Park in Texas. It's known for its incredible views and remote spots far from the beaten path, the kind of place where you can disappear for a while and just disconnect. I had been planning this trip for weeks. I'd gone through my gear multiple times, made sure I had everything I needed. I even studied the map of the park, finding a secluded spot deep into the backcountry, far away from the main trails. By the time I set out, the weather was perfect. The skies were clear, and there was a crispness to the air that made it feel like fall, even though it was just late spring. The drive to the park was a bit of a challenge, and I had to take some narrow, winding roads to get there. I passed through small towns with barely any sign of life, just empty streets and old houses. It wasn't until I reached the park that I started to feel the true isolation of it. The ranger station was empty when I checked in, with just one guy behind the desk who barely looked up from his paperwork. He gave me a quick rundown of the park's general rules and pointed me toward the backcountry trailhead, but I could tell he didn't expect anyone to venture too far out. It was around midday when I started the hike to my chosen campsite. The trail was rough, with loose rocks and steep inclines, but I enjoyed it. The air was dry, and the ground beneath my boots was a mix of hard, cracked earth and loose dirt that occasionally gave way to patches of soft grass. I could feel the sweat starting to bead on my forehead as I made my way up the mountain, but it wasn't unbearable. The landscape around me was spectacular, wide open with views of jagged peaks in the distance. I was getting farther and farther from civilization, and the silence started to creep in, making everything feel still and peaceful. By the time I reached the spot I'd picked out on the map, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. The campsite was perfect. It sat on a small rocky outcrop overlooking a valley, with towering trees surrounding me. The ground was firm, and there was a small, clear spring nearby. I couldn't have asked for a better place to set up camp. As I pulled my tent out of my pack and set it up, I could feel the wind pick up, making the trees sway. The air had a bit of a bite to it now, cooling rapidly as the sun dropped behind the mountains. I made a simple meal, nothing fancy, just some freeze-dried food. I sat there on the rocks near the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle. The smell of the wood burning mixed with the fresh mountain air, and it felt good to be so far removed from everything. No noise from cars, no buzzing of cell phones, just the fire, the wind, and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. I finished eating, packed everything up, and sat back on a flat rock near my tent. The quiet was almost unnerving. It wasn't the usual forest noises I was used to. No rustling of small animals, no chirping insects, just a stillness that was almost too quiet. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every now and then, like something was watching me. But every time I turned, nothing was there. It didn't take long for the darkness to settle in completely. I stoked the fire one last time before crawling into my tent, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had started to creep over me. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I zipped up my sleeping bag to conserve heat. It was a clear, cold night, and the stars above were brilliant. So clear. I had just started to drift off to sleep when I heard it. A faint crunch. It was so quiet that for a second, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard something. I lay still, listening, and then I heard it again. Crunch. Dry leaves, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone was walking on purpose, slowly circling my tent. I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but instead, it kept going, getting closer and closer. I felt a tightness in my chest. Something was wrong. My instincts kicked in, and I knew immediately that this wasn't just some animal. The footsteps were too human, too deliberate. I could hear them slow, then stop for a moment, just outside the fabric of my tent. I lay there, straining my ears. The silence that followed was almost worse, and then a slow, deliberate tug at the zipper of my tent. I froze, my body stiff with fear. My first thought was to grab my knife, which I always keep nearby when I'm camping solo. I could feel the cool steel of the blade against my palm as I slowly slid my hand toward it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I could still hear the zipper inching down, slow and methodical, like whoever or whatever was out there was toying with me. I couldn't wait any longer. My nerves were shot. I had to do something. I pushed my sleeping bag aside and rolled over, grabbing the knife with both hands. The zipper creaked again, moving down just a little more. With my heart in my throat, I yelled, "Who's there?" There was no answer. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves above and around me and the faint rustle of the zipper. I could hear my own breathing now, fast and shallow. Panic had taken over. Without thinking, I slashed at the fabric of the tent with all the force I could muster. The knife cut through the thin nylon like butter. The sound of the fabric ripping echoed in the night. Immediately, a shrill, guttural scream pierced the air, so loud and feral that it almost made my blood run cold. The figure that stumbled back into the darkness was barely visible in the low light of my flashlight. I could make out a man, barely. A gaunt figure with wild, unkempt hair, eyes wide and bloodshot. He was clutching his arm, which was bleeding, the blood soaking through his tattered shirt. For a second, we just stared at each other. He was breathing heavily, his face twisted with a combination of anger and something else. Desperation, maybe. I didn't wait. The moment I saw him, I bolted. I pushed my way out of the tent, heart hammering, eyes darting around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was nothing that made sense. I had no idea who he was or what he was doing out there, alone in the mountains. The flashlight beam flickered in my hand as I swung it around, my knife raised in front of me. But the figure didn't advance. He didn't move, not at first. He just stood there, his eyes locked onto mine. I turned and ran, the sound of my boots pounding against the dry earth as I scrambled toward the trail, away from the campsite. My body was moving on pure instinct, the panic fueling every step. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. My mind was racing, my pulse was thundering in my ears, and all I could think about was getting away. Somehow, I made it to my car, gasping for air, my hands shaking so badly that I had to take a few seconds just to catch my breath before I could start the engine. I didn't care about my gear, my tent, or my supplies. I just wanted to get out of there. I don't even remember the drive back to the ranger station. My mind was too far gone, replaying the night over and over. I kept seeing that man's eyes, wide and crazed, his blood-soaked arm, the way he just stood there in the dark, not moving, just watching me. When I finally reached the ranger station, I practically jumped out of my car and ran inside. I reported what had happened as best as I could, my words coming out in a rush. The ranger behind the desk didn't seem surprised. He just nodded like he'd heard this kind of thing before. "You're not the first one," he said quietly. "There's been some reports of people encountering someone out there, a vagrant, or maybe something worse. He's been spotted in these mountains for a while now." I could feel my stomach drop at his words. It was real. That man, or whatever he was out there. The Rangers had already sent search teams out after previous incidents, but the man was always one step ahead. The next morning, a search team was dispatched to the area I had camped at. They didn't find the man, but they found his campsite, an abandoned, filthy site filled with stolen supplies. There was no sign of him, but they said it looked like he had been living there for a long time. They didn't find anything that could explain who he was or why he was there. I left the park that day shaken and terrified. I don't think I'll ever go back to Davis Mountains. I don't know who that man was or why he was there, but I was damn lucky to get out of there alive. It was supposed to be a fun, carefree sleepover. You know, the kind where you stay up too late, stuff your face with junk food, and talk about the most random things until you both get so tired you can barely keep your eyes open. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. It had been a long time since I'd had a sleepover at Olivia's house, and I was excited to catch up with her. Her house was a nice, cozy two-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood in California, the kind of place where you'd never expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. The kind of place where the biggest concern was figuring out which movie to watch or if there was enough pizza for both of us. The evening started like any other sleepover. Olivia and I made popcorn, ordered a bunch of snacks, and picked out a cheesy horror movie we were both way too scared to watch alone, but found hilarious when we were together. We huddled on the couch in the living room, the soft glow of the TV screen lighting up our faces in the otherwise dark room. Olivia's parents were upstairs, so it was just the two of us, just like old times. The house smelled like lavender from the candles Olivia's mom kept lit, and there was that comforting, familiar hum of the refrigerator in the background. I remember the way the couch cushions felt beneath me, soft and worn from years of use, and how the blankets we had piled on top of us were just the right amount of warmth. It was nice. But after a while, even the best nights start to slow down. Olivia and I grew quiet, both of us drifting in and out of sleep. I think I dozed off for a while, but the strange thing was I didn't feel fully asleep. I was aware of the quiet house, the low hum of the movie still playing in the background, and the ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. But then, out of nowhere, I felt this sudden dryness in my throat. I tried to ignore it at first, but it wouldn't go away. I didn't want to wake Olivia, so I decided to get up and sneak into the kitchen for a glass of water. The living room was dim, lit only by the glow from the TV screen. I stood up, stretching my arms over my head to shake off the sleepiness, and made my way to the kitchen. I remember my feet feeling cold on the hardwood floor, each step muffled by the carpet in the living room. The silence in the house was almost suffocating. As I passed the living room window, I glanced outside. The backyard was barely visible through the thin curtains, but the porch light was on, casting a pale, yellowish glow across the yard. I stopped in my tracks. Something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a tree branch swaying maybe, or an odd shadow. But no. There, standing still, right under the oak tree in the center of the yard, was a figure. A person. Tall. Almost impossibly still. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure was too far away for me to make out any details, but I could see the silhouette clearly enough. A person. Standing in the yard, barely visible under the dim porch light. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was someone from the neighborhood, but why would anyone be standing in the yard at this hour? The house was dark. Olivia's parents were asleep. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. Then it hit me. The figure wasn't moving. It was standing there, staring through the glass door, right at me. I could see nothing but that figure, standing motionless, with no sign of them moving at all. The fear that washed over me was like nothing I had ever felt. I tried to force my feet to move, but they were stuck. Every inch of my body was screaming at me to run, to hide, to do something, but I couldn't. I stayed there, crouched behind the kitchen counter, but unable to tear my eyes away from the figure in the yard. I don't know how long I stayed like that, trembling, but finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of the situation. I had to get back to Olivia. I had to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Slowly, I crept back toward the living room, my legs unsteady beneath me, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing outside. I had to wake Olivia. I shook her gently, my voice barely above a whisper. "Olivia, Olivia, wake up." She groaned in irritation, slowly opening her eyes. "What is it, Danielle? It's the middle of the night." "There's someone outside," I whispered urgently. "Please, wake up. I need you to come with me." Olivia groggily sat up, rubbing her eyes. She was still half asleep and clearly annoyed. "What are you talking about? It's probably just a raccoon or something. I'm going back to sleep." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "Please, just come with me." She sighed but followed me back to the kitchen, still rubbing her eyes as she walked. I felt a little relief knowing I wasn't alone in this. But when we reached the kitchen, the backyard was empty. The figure was gone. Olivia blinked, clearly not understanding why I was so worked up. "Danielle, calm down. There's nothing out there. You probably just imagined it." But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something wasn't right. I looked outside again, trying to convince myself I had been mistaken. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They were clear as day, imprinted in the dirt just outside the glass door. They were fresh. I could see the dampness of the earth still clinging to them, as if someone had been standing there just moments ago. My heart lurched. "Olivia, those weren't there before. I swear," I said, my voice trembling. "Those weren't there when we were in here earlier." Olivia looked down at the prints, her face slowly draining of color. "What the hell?" she whispered, stepping back from the door. We both just stared at the footprints, unable to make sense of it. Neither of us had heard anything, no footsteps, no sound of anyone moving around. Yet there they were, clear and undeniable. I locked the door immediately, though I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. I checked the other windows, but there were no signs of forced entry. Everything appeared to be in place, but my gut told me something was wrong. I couldn't stop feeling like we were being watched. We spent the rest of the night huddled together on the couch, too scared to go back to sleep. I kept glancing at the windows, the backyard, the shadows outside, half expecting to see that figure again. But nothing happened. The next morning, Olivia's parents brushed off our fears. "You girls were probably just scared from that scary movie," her mom said as she served us breakfast. "Nothing to worry about." But when we turned on the news, everything changed. Authorities were reporting that a dangerous convict had escaped from a nearby prison the night before. The police warned that he was on the loose and possibly in the area. They showed a mugshot followed by a sketch. My stomach sank. The man in the sketch looked exactly like the figure I had seen outside. "That's him. That's the guy," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. I could barely breathe. It was him. The man in the sketch. He was the same person I had seen standing outside, watching me. "We have to tell my parents," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. Olivia's parents had no idea what had happened. They still thought we had been imagining it. Olivia's parents didn't take us seriously at first, but after showing them the news report and the sketch, they finally called the police. They came to the house, and soon officers were combing the yard and the neighborhood. They checked the nearby streets and questioned neighbors, but the police didn't find anything. They left after a while, saying they'd continue their search elsewhere. But they did find something. Trampled bushes in a neighbor's yard, footprints that led from one house to another. A dirty rag discarded near the fence. It was clear now someone had been lurking around the neighborhood. But by the time the police arrived, he was gone. I wanted to feel relieved, but all I could feel was dread. That night, I tried to sleep again. I really did, but the fear wouldn't leave. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing outside, staring through the glass door. It was a quiet Thursday night in late October, the kind of night where the air is crisp and sharp, and the streets are empty except for the occasional car passing by. I had just moved into a small duplex on the edge of town, about 20 minutes outside Sacramento. The house wasn't much, just a tiny place with a living room that barely fit my couch and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. I had a roommate, but she was out of town visiting her family for the weekend. So for the next few days, I had the whole place to myself. At first, it felt weird, but I was used to living alone. In fact, I kind of liked the quiet. It gave me space to study without distractions. I was in my final year of college, studying late into the night for an exam that I couldn't afford to fail. The clock on the wall read 10:30 p.m., and I had just finished reviewing a set of notes when I realized I hadn't eaten anything substantial all day. My stomach growled loudly, a reminder that I had skipped lunch. The coffee from earlier had worn off, and I needed something to keep me going through the night. I grabbed my phone and opened the delivery app, scrolling through the options. There was a local pizza place that I'd tried once before, and it was close enough that I wouldn't have to wait forever. I wasn't in the mood for anything fancy, just something comforting to fill the void. After a few taps, I confirmed my order and sat back in my chair, hoping that the food would arrive quickly. As I waited, I tried to focus on my notes again, but my mind kept drifting. I glanced out the window, looking at the still street outside. Everything was so quiet. Around 10:50 p.m., I heard a car pull into the driveway. I glanced up from my notes and saw headlights flash through the window. The delivery driver had arrived. I got up from my desk, stretching my stiff muscles, and made my way down the hallway toward the door. I opened it, expecting to see a familiar face. Young, maybe in their 20s, someone who'd just finished a shift and wanted to drop off my food quickly before heading home. But instead, standing there on my doorstep was an older man. He was probably in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with graying hair and a thick mustache. He wore a cap pulled low over his eyes, and his expression was unreadable. He didn't smile or greet me in the usual friendly way that delivery drivers tend to. Instead, he just stood there for a moment, holding the bag of food out to me with both hands. I took the bag, but he didn't immediately let go. His grip on it tightened, just enough for me to feel it. I looked up at him, feeling an odd sense of discomfort. "Thanks," I said, trying to keep things casual, but my voice felt thin, almost shaky. "You live here alone?" His voice was gruff, like he wasn't used to speaking to people. I hesitated, unsure how to answer, but I gave a short nod. He didn't move, his eyes not quite meeting mine, but focused somewhere over my shoulder. "No boyfriend around?" I shifted uncomfortably, trying to ignore the odd tension that was building between us. "No," I said quickly, "I'm just studying for an exam." Again, he didn't let go of the bag, standing there in silence. It was like he was waiting for something else, but I didn't know what. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, trying to speed up the interaction. "Look, I've got to go," I said, finally pulling the bag from his grip. He nodded slowly. "Stay safe," he said, his voice lowering slightly as he stepped back from the door. I didn't say anything else, I just closed the door quickly, locking it behind me. Something about the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd asked those questions, made my skin crawl. It wasn't normal for a delivery driver to ask such personal things, right? But I tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing. Just some strange guy who had a weird way of interacting with people. I turned away from the door, back toward the living room, and decided to focus on my studies. I opened the food and set it on the coffee table, but even as I ate, I kept thinking about the exchange, the questions, his eyes. I couldn't get the feeling that something was off out of my mind. As the hours passed, I tried to get back into my study routine, but my focus kept slipping. The night felt heavy, like the silence was pressing in on me. I kept looking at the clock, checking the time. Midnight, 12:30, 1 a.m. I knew I should have gone to bed, but my mind was too restless. I couldn't shake the unease from the delivery. I decided to take a break. Maybe I was just tired. I stood up, stretching again, and decided to walk around the house for a bit to clear my head. I made my way down the hallway to the kitchen, my feet soft on the hardwood floor, the air growing colder as the night deepened. I opened the kitchen window slightly, hoping to let in some fresh air, and stood there for a moment, just listening. That's when I heard it. A soft click, the unmistakable sound of a latch being undone. I froze. It came from the back of the house, from the backyard gate. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, but it sounded like someone was outside. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, and crept toward the kitchen door that led to the backyard. Before I could make it, I heard a faint rattle, soft at first, then louder and more aggressive. The back door handle was shaking. Someone was trying to get in. I quickly turned off the kitchen lights and grabbed my phone, my hands trembling. I pressed myself against the wall, my back to the kitchen window, praying that whoever was outside hadn't seen me. I dared to peek through the blinds, just a sliver. I couldn't see clearly at first, but then there he was, the delivery driver. He wasn't wearing his cap now, and I could see his face more clearly. His eyes darted around the backyard, looking for a way in. He was staring at the back door now, trying the handle again, this time with more force, as if he thought maybe it would give way. I stood frozen, unable to move. My phone was still in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to call the police. Suddenly, there was a shout from outside. "Hey, I already called the cops! Get the hell out of here!" I jumped at the sound of Mr. Alvarez's voice coming from next door. I hadn't realized he'd been watching. The delivery driver froze, his eyes wide. But before he could react, he turned and disappeared into the shadows between the houses. Minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars lit up the street. I heard sirens in the distance, getting closer, and my stomach turned. I backed away from the window, not daring to move until I saw the officers arrive. The police questioned me, asking about the man, but I was in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. They searched the area, finding footprints around the back door. The next morning, I was still in shock. I barely slept. I kept replaying the events over and over in my mind. A few hours later, I got a call from the police. They'd found the delivery driver. He was hiding out in a nearby park, and they arrested him. It turns out he wasn't even a legitimate employee. He'd stolen someone else's delivery account using fake credentials. He had a criminal record from another state with charges for breaking and entering. That afternoon, I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend for a few days. When I returned to the house, I installed security cameras, got a dog, and changed my routines. I couldn't take any chances. I never spent another night alone in that house. The whole experience stayed with me, reminding me that even the most ordinary moments, like ordering a pizza, something so simple, can become a nightmare when you least expect it. It all started with a quiet, ordinary drive. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, and I wasn't in a hurry. It was a solo visit to my aunt's house, a long overdue break from my busy life in the city. My car was well maintained, and the road, though isolated, seemed peaceful. A part of me enjoyed the thought of getting away from everything. No noise, no distractions, just open roads. The highway stretched out before me, a lonely ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the barren, flat landscape of Texas. Cornfields stretched to the horizon, their long green stalks swaying lazily in the wind. There were no trees, no buildings in sight, just miles of emptiness. The air outside was stifling, even with the air conditioner on full blast. I cracked the window, letting in the heavy, humid air, the scent of earth, dust, and dry grass mixing together. As I drove, I started thinking about what I would do once I arrived. Maybe I'd stay a few days. My aunt always had a way of making me feel at ease, and I could use some of that comfort after a long stretch of stressful weeks. I was lost in thought when the car jerked, a strange noise cutting through the quiet. I looked at the dashboard in confusion, but everything seemed normal at first. Then it happened. The engine sputtered, and the car came to a slow, grinding halt. I immediately tried to restart it, turning the key with a sense of rising panic, but nothing. The engine refused to turn over. I leaned back in the seat, staring at the dashboard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The gas gauge read half full, so it wasn't that. Maybe something with the engine, but I wasn't exactly a mechanic. I was stuck, and I had no idea what to do. My phone, of course, had no signal, and there wasn't a single car in sight. The road ahead was barren, the kind of empty stretch where you don't even feel like you're in the same world anymore. A cold sweat broke out on my brow as I realized that I might be stranded out here for a while. There wasn't a town for miles, and I didn't know how long it would take for someone to pass by. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe I could walk to the nearest town? That felt like a stretch, considering how far out I was, but I had no other choice. So, with a resigned sigh, I grabbed my bag, locked the doors, and stepped out onto the road. The heat hit me immediately, wrapping around my skin like a thick blanket. I started walking, trying to get some direction by looking for any signs of life. After what felt like forever, I kept walking. The sun was setting, and the atmosphere started to feel chilly. I spotted something in the distance, a small cabin near the edge of the cornfields, barely visible behind some overgrown brush. It was worn down, maybe abandoned, but it was something. A place to maybe ask for help. I began walking toward it, my boots crunching on the dry, cracked ground. The road was deserted, and the wind whispered through the tall cornstalks on either side. The closer I got to the cabin, the more I felt this strange sense of unease creeping over me. It wasn't like I could turn back now, though. I needed help. The cabin was old, really old. The wood was chipped, the roof sagging in places, and the porch creaked under the weight of time. I walked up the creaky steps and knocked on the door. A long pause followed, and I was just about to turn around when I heard footsteps on the other side. The door creaked open, revealing an old man. He looked like he had been around forever, his skin wrinkled and weathered from years under the sun, his hair thin and white. He smiled. His voice was soft and welcoming. "Well, look at you. You've walked a long way, haven't ya? Come on in, come on in. You look like you could use some rest." At that point, I didn't even question it. I was tired, I needed water, and most importantly, I was in desperate need of a phone or a way to figure out what had gone wrong with my car. So I stepped inside. Inside, the cabin smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. The fire crackled faintly in a stone hearth, the only source of warmth in the otherwise chilly room. The old man motioned to a chair by the fire. But like I said, I was exhausted. I wasn't going to let my discomfort stop me from asking for help. The firelight flickered across the room. The cabin was sparsely furnished with only the essentials: an old rocking chair in one corner, a worn-out rug on the floor, and shelves crammed with jars of canned goods and strange knickknacks. The walls were lined with faded paintings, most of them crooked, and there was an odd, almost oppressive stillness to the place. "Sit, sit. I'll get you a glass of water," the old man said as he shuffled off toward a small wooden counter. He returned with a glass of water that felt cool and refreshing. I didn't realize just how thirsty I was until I took a long gulp, and suddenly I felt a little more alive. The old man sat across from me, his eyes studying me closely. "You've got a long road ahead, don't you?" he said, his voice oddly soft. I nodded, unsure of what to say. I was grateful for his help. The weight of the heat and the stress of the situation were starting to catch up with me. Without realizing it, I leaned back in the chair, the warmth of the fire relaxing my body. My eyelids grew heavy and I started to feel drowsy. I wasn't sure how much time passed, but the next thing I knew, I had drifted off to sleep. I woke to the sound of something scraping, sharp, metal on metal. It wasn't the wind or anything natural. It was deliberate. My eyes snapped open, and I froze. The fire was low now, casting only faint light across the room. I blinked several times, trying to clear the fog in my brain, and that's when I saw him. The old man was standing in front of the hearth, his back to me. His movements were slow, deliberate. His hands were working something metal, and the sound of it was jarring. The scraping of a knife against a stone was the only thing I could hear. A chill ran down my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. My heart began to race, but I couldn't make my legs move. I was trying to make sense of what was happening. His movements were unnaturally calm, methodical. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. And then, just as I thought I might have imagined the whole thing, he turned. Slowly. His face was twisted in a smile. His eyes locked onto mine. "I didn't expect you to wake up," he said, his voice so soft, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver through me. I didn't think. I didn't even hesitate. Panic surged through my body, and I leaped to my feet, knocking the chair over with a loud crash. My heart pounded in my chest as I dashed for the door. I heard him move behind me. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and I could hear the faint scrape of the knife being drawn through the air. I didn't dare look back. I burst through the door, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The fields stretched endlessly before me, the tall corn swaying in the wind, but I couldn't think of anything but running. I pushed through the stalks, my legs stumbling over the uneven ground, but I kept moving. My lungs burned with each breath, but I didn't stop. I could hear him, his voice calling out in the distance, heavy footsteps trailing behind me. I pushed harder, cutting through the thick corn, not daring to look back. My heart felt like it was going to explode. My legs felt like lead, but I kept pushing through the darkness, desperate to get away from him. It felt like hours before I finally reached the road again. I flagged down a passing car, barely able to catch my breath. The driver didn't ask questions. He must have seen the panic in my eyes, because he immediately called the authorities. When the police arrived, I led them back to the cabin. But when we got there was nothing. No sign of the old man. The cabin was still there, but it was empty, abandoned. They searched the area for hours, but they found nothing. No tracks. No trace of him. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was real or if I just lost my mind for a second. But all I know is this: I'm lucky to be alive. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the scrape of metal on stone. I wasn't looking for a place like this. Honestly, I wasn't even supposed to be in California that summer. But my life had this way of pulling me in directions I didn't expect, and by the time I realized I needed a break from it all, I found myself scrolling through Craigslist for a short-term rental. I didn't know what I was really hoping to find, but something about an old cottage, tucked away in the foothills, caught my eye. It wasn't glamorous. In fact, it looked like the kind of place you'd drive past without a second glance. The photos weren't professionally taken. The description was sparse, just a couple of lines saying it was an old house for rent, quiet, affordable, nature all around, no air conditioning, followed by a number to call. The price was a bargain, especially for the summer in California. So I called, and within an hour, the deal was made. I had just wrapped up a grueling 6 months at my tech job in San Francisco. It had been intense. Long hours, stress, and endless meetings. I worked as a project manager, overseeing a small team working on an app that was supposed to revolutionize the way people interacted with data. The hours were long, and honestly, the work wasn't all that fulfilling. I found myself constantly chasing deadlines, trying to impress a boss who was too busy to ever acknowledge a job well done. That summer, I needed a reset. I wanted solitude. A break from emails and pings, a place where I could turn off and focus on something else. That's when I found the cottage. The place was about 2 hours outside of Los Angeles, nestled in a small town that wasn't much more than a gas station and a few scattered houses. The landscape was beautiful, rolling hills, towering pines, and a clear sky that went on forever. It felt like the kind of place where the world couldn't find you. When I arrived at the house, it was just as the pictures showed. It was small but charming, the kind of house that had seen better days. The white paint on the exterior was peeling, revealing patches of raw wood. The porch was creaky, with a few boards that threatened to give way underfoot. Inside, the furniture was worn but functional, with faded upholstery and old wooden floors that creaked as you walked. The kitchen had that old, musty smell of disuse, but the windows let in a ton of light, and the air had a crispness to it that I didn't even know I needed. What struck me the most, though, was the silence. There was no hum of appliances, no buzzing of lights, no faint sound of traffic in the distance. It was like the house was waiting for something, holding its breath. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. The first night was pretty uneventful. I unpacked a bit, then went for a walk around the property, soaking in the fresh air. The heat wasn't unbearable, but it was warm enough to make me sweat, especially for a city guy used to the fog of San Francisco. I sat on the porch for a while as the sun dipped behind the hills, feeling that familiar weight lift off my shoulders. I was alone, and for the first time in months, I was okay with that. No emails, no calls, no expectations. The house had no air conditioning, which I was fully aware of when I booked it. It was an inconvenience, but nothing I couldn't manage. There were fans in the house, old boxy ones, but they didn't do much. The air felt stale, and as the evening dragged on, it became clear that the heat would be something I'd have to get used to. I had the windows open, hoping for a breeze, but the house seemed to trap the heat, holding onto it like a blanket. I didn't think much of it when I lay down in the small bedroom that first night. The bed was simple, a queen size with an old wooden frame. The sheets were worn, and the pillows weren't the most comfortable, but it wasn't bad. The room itself was small, with the same creaky floors and a large window that faced out toward the hills. The walls were painted a faded blue, and there were a few pictures hung crookedly, an old beach scene, a small still life of a vase with flowers. The ceiling had some cracks in it, and the faintest smell of mildew lingered in the corners. It felt like a place that hadn't seen life in a while. But that night, the silence wasn't as comforting as I thought it would be. As I lay there, drifting off to sleep, I noticed how absolutely quiet the room was. I mean, there was no sound. Not even the usual hum of the fridge or the occasional creak of old houses settling. There was nothing, and that's when I first noticed the breathing. It wasn't loud at first, it wasn't anything to get alarmed about, just a slow, steady sound. At first, I thought it was my own breath, but then I realized it wasn't. It was too slow, too deep, and it wasn't coming from me. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was just settling, or maybe there was something outside, a tree branch brushing against the window, or some critter moving in the attic. But the sound continued, slow, steady, in and out like a person breathing while they slept. I didn't get up, I didn't look around, I just stayed there, trying to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. But the more I focused on it, the more it seemed to fill the room, like the air itself was breathing in rhythm with that sound. I spent the whole night listening to it, trying not to let my mind race. The next morning, I dismissed it. I thought it was the house creaking, or maybe I had just imagined it. It wasn't anything worth worrying about, but that night, the breathing was back, and this time it was louder. I woke up in the middle of the night to the same sound, but it was more pronounced. It was coming from just beside the bed, and I could almost feel it. The room felt off, heavier, like the air pressure had changed. I felt like something was there, watching me. I held my breath to see if it would stop, but it didn't. It kept going. I tried to tell myself it was just the house again. Maybe the walls were thin and sound was traveling from another room. Maybe it was an animal outside, or maybe I was just imagining things. But the more I thought about it, the less rational it seemed. There was no way something could breathe so steadily, with no interruptions. No way it could mimic the sound of a person perfectly. I tried to ignore it for the next couple of days. I spent time outside, walking around the property, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt old. Not just in the usual way that old houses feel, but like it had seen too many years, like it had absorbed something, some kind of history that it wasn't willing to let go of. But still, I couldn't put my finger on it. There was no logical explanation. The place was isolated, remote, and ancient, but it shouldn't have been creepy. The air inside was always still, like the house was holding its breath along with me. I would lie in bed at night listening for the breathing. Sometimes it was faint, and sometimes it was right there, loud and clear, just at the edge of my awareness. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to move. And then one night, it moved closer. I woke up again, and the room was suffocatingly still. The moonlight from outside cast long shadows across the floor. I lay there, wide awake, listening. At first, it was faint, but then there it was again, the slow, steady breath, in, out, in, out. I could feel it. It was in the room with me, and this time it was closer. The weight of it pressed down on me, thick like the humidity outside. It was no longer just the sound. I could feel it like something was standing next to the bed, something real. My heart was racing, but I didn't move. I didn't want to move. I held my breath, trying to make it stop, but it didn't. I couldn't hear the walls creak or the wind outside. The only sound was that slow, steady breathing. I kept waiting for it to stop, waiting for it to fade, but it didn't. The seconds stretched on like hours until I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly turned my head just a little so I could see the doorway, the dark hallway beyond, and that's when I saw it. Nothing. There was nothing there. No one in the doorway, no shape, no shadow, but the breathing was still there. Close enough to feel. I couldn't do it anymore. I packed a bag. I grabbed my things in the dark, moving quickly, as quietly as I could, trying not to let my shaking hands betray me. I didn't bother with the lights. I didn't care if I left the house a mess. I couldn't stay there another second. By the time I had everything together, it was past midnight. I didn't wait. I didn't even check the house again. I just left. I drove all the way back to LA that night, shaking. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. What had I just experienced? Was I going crazy? Was the heat messing with my head? I didn't go home right away. I didn't feel safe. I drove straight to a hotel and rented a room for the night. The moment I stepped into the hotel room, I felt the relief wash over me. The silence wasn't too much here. There was nothing to listen for. I didn't go back to the cottage. I couldn't. And I won't. I don't know what was in that house. I don't know if it was a trick of my mind or something else, but I do know one thing. Something was there, and I'll never go back to find out what it was. I didn't think anything could go wrong. When Emily suggested a weekend hike out in the Texas Hill Country, I thought it was just another one of those spontaneous, feel-good ideas she always had. She'd been talking about it for weeks, showing me photos of the beautiful quiet trails, the wildflowers in bloom, the thick oak trees towering over narrow dirt paths. To be honest, I wasn't the most outdoorsy guy. I preferred a weekend on the couch, and to be honest, watching shows or playing some video games. But Emily was different. She loved the outdoors, and I liked spending time with her, so I went along with it. The drive out to the trailhead was long, winding through the Texas countryside with only a few scattered farms and ranches along the way. We talked, joked, and laughed during the drive. The air felt thick with the promise of adventure. I remember the sun hitting the windshield, making everything look bright and sharp, the landscape stretching out in front of us like a postcard. It was peaceful in a way I'd never experienced before. No cell service, no distractions, just us and the wildness of nature. We reached the trailhead a little after dawn. There weren't many cars in the parking lot, which I found odd. I figured a place as scenic as this would have a few more people around, but the emptiness felt serene. A bit isolating, though. Emily seemed unbothered by it, hopping out of the car and stretching her arms above her head with a sigh of relief. She looked at me with that spark in her eyes. I grabbed my pack and joined her, trying to match her enthusiasm. The trail itself was narrow. with tall grasses brushing against our legs as we walked. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and pine. I could hear the chirping of birds in the distance and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or something else small moving in the underbrush. The farther we walked, the quieter it became. The trees loomed over us, casting long shadows on the trail, making the air feel cooler, but still thick with humidity. I noticed right away that the heat wasn't as bad as I expected. There was a cool breeze now and then pushing through the branches, but it still felt like summer. I was sweating through my shirt, and by midday I could feel the sticky dampness starting to cling to my skin. My water bottle was almost half gone, and I hadn't even realized how thirsty I was until I felt the dryness in my throat. Emily, of course, was as chipper as ever. She stopped occasionally to point out things along the trail, wildflowers, strange rock formations, the occasional bird she'd spot perched in the trees. But it wasn't long before the fatigue started to catch up with me. I could feel the heat getting to me, and despite my best efforts to push through, it was becoming harder to keep up. I knew Emily wanted to keep going, so I tried not to show it. She always seemed to have boundless energy when it came to hiking. We kept walking until we saw the stream. It was a small, clear creek that meandered lazily through the rocks. The water sparkled in the sunlight, inviting us like an oasis in the middle of the wilderness. Emily immediately went for it, dropping her pack on the ground with a sigh of relief and kneeling down to scoop up water with her hands. I followed suit, my throat burning for something cold and fresh. I didn't think twice as I took my first drink, feeling the cool water slide down my throat and wash away the dryness. We refilled our bottles and drank more. After a few minutes, I felt much better, more energized. We stayed for a bit, enjoying the peacefulness, and Emily talked about how she loved finding places like this untouched by the outside world. I couldn't argue with her. It was beautiful. But when we started walking again, I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. My stomach churned slightly, not in a painful way, but just enough to make me feel off. It wasn't enough to be alarming, but it definitely made me aware that my body wasn't quite back to normal after the heat and exertion. Emily, always the optimist, didn't seem to notice. She kept chatting away, talking about where we'd go next, what we'd do when we got back to town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My legs started to feel unsteady, as if they weren't quite as strong as they had been an hour ago. It wasn't long before Emily stopped walking and put a hand on her stomach. "Jack, I don't feel right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced over at her, and her face was pale. I thought maybe she was just tired, but there was a look in her eyes. "What do you mean?" I asked, but before she could respond, her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the ground. My stomach dropped. "Emily!" I shouted, rushing to her side. Her skin was clammy, her breath shallow. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, but I had no idea what to do. She couldn't be dehydrated, we'd just drunk from the stream. And we hadn't been walking for that long, so exhaustion shouldn't have set in this fast. I tried to help her up, but my own legs felt like they were turning to jelly. The dizziness hit me next, sudden, sharp, and overwhelming. Before I knew it, I was kneeling next to her, barely able to keep my eyes open. The last thing I remember before everything went black was her face, twisted in pain, her hands clutching her stomach as if she could stop the wave of nausea rolling through her. When I woke up, everything was spinning. My head was throbbing, and I had no idea how long I had been unconscious. My mouth was dry, and my body felt heavy. I opened my eyes, struggling to focus. The forest was darker now, shadows stretching long across the trail. My ears were ringing, but in the silence, it felt like the world had gotten quieter somehow. Emily was still next to me, her face pale and sweat-slicked, her body still limp. Panic flooded me again. My throat tightened, and I crawled over to her, shaking her gently. "Emily, come on. Wake up." I was barely able to get the words out, my voice barely a croak. I felt like I was dying right there beside her. Every movement I made felt slow, as if my limbs were made of lead. I glanced around, but the forest looked different. The trees seemed to loom over us, casting long, distorted shadows. The trail, once so clear, now felt like it was closing in. That's when I saw him, a man, a lone figure, emerging from the trees. At first, I couldn't make him out clearly, but as he stepped closer, I saw he was tall, gruff-looking, wearing hiking gear that looked like it had seen better days. His face was worn, his skin weathered from years of exposure to the elements. He stopped in front of us and looked down, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "You two okay?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in a while. "I don't think so," I said weakly, my voice barely a whisper. We drank from the stream. We don't feel good." The man didn't respond right away. He just crouched down, eyes scanning the area. "I have a cabin nearby. It's not far. I can help you both get there. You need rest." I didn't hesitate. I should have, but I didn't. Emily was too weak to move, and I felt like my body was shutting down. The thought of rest and shelter, of getting out of the woods, was too much to resist. Okay, I said, and with his help, we both managed to get to our feet. Emily could barely stand on her own, so I kept a hand on her, supporting her weight as best as I could. We followed the man, leaving the main trail behind. The trees grew denser, the darkness settling in faster as the sun dipped below the horizon. The path became less clear, the ground underfoot uneven, with roots snaking out from the soil, threatening to trip us with every step. The silence around us was thick, like the forest was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man didn't say much, but every now and then I'd catch him glancing over his shoulder, his eyes flicking between us. Then Emily collapsed. I had no strength left to catch her. She just crumpled to the ground like a rag doll, her body going limp. I dropped to my knees beside her, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Emily," I cried out, but she didn't respond. The man crouched beside her, and I could see a sick smile creeping across his face. It was a slow, deliberate thing. "Guess that stream got you real good, huh?" he muttered under his breath, almost as if he were talking to himself. That's when it hit me. The water. The stream. That's what had done this to us, but it was more than just bad water. It was deliberate. It had been poisoned. And this man, he was the reason. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. My body was failing me, and I felt the panic rising like bile in the back of my throat. My heart hammered in my chest. This man wasn't just helping us. The idea of him taking us somewhere, wherever that cabin was, I could already picture it. A small, hidden place in the middle of the woods, far from anyone who could help. I couldn't let him do that. I couldn't. Not when Emily was lying there, barely breathing. With the little bit of energy I had, I reached down and grabbed a rock. My fingers were slick with sweat, but I didn't care. I swung it at the man's head, hitting him with all the force I could muster. He stumbled back, but didn't fall. His eyes flashed with anger, and before I knew it, he was on top of me, pinning me to the ground with terrifying strength. His breath was hot against my neck, his grip tightening around my throat. I fought back, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't move fast enough. But then, like a miracle, I heard voices, hikers, people coming down the trail. They must have heard the struggle, or maybe they were just passing by. But they were close. The man's eyes darted around, panic flashing across his face. Without warning, he pulled away and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the night. The hikers found us minutes later, their flashlights bouncing off the trees as they rushed to our side. They helped me lift Emily, and one of them called for help. I don't even remember exactly what happened after that. I was too exhausted, too disoriented. When the paramedics arrived, they confirmed what I had already known. The stream had been poisoned. It was deliberate. The water had been laced with a toxic plant extract that had caused both of us to collapse. They said we were lucky to be alive. The authorities tried to track down the man, but they never found him. Emily and I survived. We made it out of that forest. But I will never forget the way that man's smile twisted when he saw us on the ground, helpless. It was supposed to be just another one of those typical sleepovers we used to have all the time. Nothing special, just a night for the three of us to hang out. You know, the kind of night where you stay up late talking about random stuff, binge watch movies, and laugh until your stomach hurts. Nothing ever went wrong during those nights. The worst thing that might happen would be spilling soda on the carpet. There wasn't any special occasion, just an excuse to spend some quality time together, far away from the daily grind of school and life. Stephanie's house was the usual hangout spot. It wasn't anything extraordinary, but it had a charm to it. Nestled in a quiet suburb of California, the house sat in a cul-de-sac, surrounded by similar homes, neat lawns, picket fences, and a faint smell of freshly cut grass always lingered in the air. The weather that night was typical of a California spring evening, cool but not cold, with the scent of eucalyptus trees faintly drifting in from outside. We started the night around 8 p.m., setting up our sleeping bags in the living room. The lights were dimmed low, and we were wrapped in blankets, huddled together in front of the TV. We were watching horror movies, nothing too terrifying, just the usual slasher films with too many predictable jump scares. But we didn't mind. We were just happy to be hanging out, far away from our parents and the stress of school. Stephanie's older brother, Ryan, was upstairs in his room, lost in his gaming world. We didn't mind him. Ryan was 18, a couple years older than us, and he always had his headphones on, completely absorbed in whatever game he was playing. The only time he'd interact with us was when we needed to borrow something from his room or when he'd tease us about watching stupid horror movies. We all knew that if we needed anything, we'd just call out to him, but for now, he was a non-issue. We were in our own world, laughing, snacking, and teasing each other about the ridiculousness of the horror movie cliches. When we decided to take a break around 11:30 p.m., Rachel and I went into the kitchen to make some more popcorn. The scent of butter filled the air as I opened the microwave, staring at the spinning bag of popcorn. I could hear Stephanie in the living room, flipping through Netflix for the next movie, the soft hum of the TV just barely audible from the kitchen. As I stood there, waiting for the microwave to beep, I heard it. A loud crash. The sound of glass shattering. My stomach dropped immediately, and I turned to Rachel, who was still by the counter, her hand frozen midair, holding a salt shaker. We both stared at each other, wide-eyed, but neither of us said anything at first. The noise had come from the living room, but it didn't make sense. It wasn't just a clink or a bang. It was a sharp, violent crash, like something heavy had hit the window. I could feel my heart starting to race, my breath growing shallow. Rachel's face went pale as she slowly set the salt shaker down. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "What was that?" I couldn't bring myself to move from the kitchen. Rachel, who had been standing next to me, was the first to act. She took a step forward, and that's when we heard it again. Footsteps. At first, it was barely audible, like a distant thud, muffled by the walls of the house. But the sound grew clearer, sharper, and my blood ran cold. Someone was walking outside, fast, heavy steps, like someone was moving quickly toward the front door. Rachel, who had been standing just behind me, grabbed my arm. "We need to hide. Now." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but there was a frantic urgency in her eyes. I nodded without thinking, my brain still trying to process what was happening. We didn't know if the footsteps belonged to a neighbor or a stranger, but one thing was for sure, the danger felt too real. Rachel darted toward the back door, her hands shaking as she quickly locked it. I followed her, my feet barely touching the floor as I hurried to Stephanie's room. We didn't speak, couldn't speak. The silence was too oppressive, too thick with fear. We knew we had to act fast. I grabbed my phone from my pocket, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't even remember if I had dialed the right number at first. But then the 911 operator answered, her voice cutting through the silence like a lifeline. 911, what's your emergency? She asked, calm but firm. I forced myself to speak, though my voice was shaky and barely above a whisper. There's someone trying to break into the house, I said, my words tumbling out faster than I control. I don't know who they are, but they just threw something through the window. I think they're outside, and we're trapped. We need help. I could hear the operator's voice on the other end asking for details, but my brain was foggy, overwhelmed with fear. I could barely focus on her questions as I explained the address, trying my best to give clear information, though it felt like everything was moving in slow motion. The operator assured me help was on the way and advised me to stay quiet and hidden. I hung up, but my body was still frozen in place. Stephanie was already in the hallway, her face ghostly pale. She didn't need to say anything. We all knew what we had to do. She rushed into her bedroom, slamming the door behind her, and I heard her shove the dresser in front of it, blocking the entrance. I followed Rachel inside, and we huddled together on the floor. I could hear our breaths ragged and loud in the silence of the room. We didn't know if the person was inside the house or still outside, but everything felt wrong. The house, which had felt so safe just hours ago, now felt like a trap. Suddenly I heard it, the faint creak of a door opening, distant but unmistakable. Ryan's door. I froze, my heart sinking in my chest. He hadn't heard anything. He was still upstairs, likely playing his game, oblivious to the danger that was about to find him. What's going on? I heard Ryan's voice call softly, like he was confused, still half in his own world. I wanted to shout at him, to warn him, but no words came. He had no idea. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of fast footsteps running up the stairs. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs in what seemed like seconds. The figure that appeared in the hallway was dark, a shadow at first. Ryan, stepping out of his room, looked toward the figure, confused. What's going on? He asked again, but before he could react, the dark shape lunged at him. The sound of their bodies colliding was like a thunderclap in the silence. My heart skipped a beat and I felt my chest tighten. It was all happening so fast. Ryan barely had time to react before he was shoved back against the railing of the staircase. His voice, shocked and desperate, filled the air as he tried to break free, shoving the intruder back with everything he had. I could hear the struggle, the sound of bodies crashing against the wall, of feet scrambling on the wooden floor. Ryan was fighting. I could hear him grunting, but the attacker was strong. It was clear this wasn't a random robbery. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of something metal scraping against metal. A knife. From the corner of my eye, I saw Rachel, her hands still gripping the kitchen knife she had grabbed earlier. She was trembling, her face pale, but her eyes were fixed on the door, waiting. We had no plan. We just knew we couldn't sit here and do nothing. The sounds of the struggle continued. Ryan shouted again, his voice hoarse with panic. And then, finally, the sirens, the faint sound of them in the distance. It felt like the longest minute of my life, but somehow the sirens grew louder. The police arrived. The red and blue lights flooded the windows of Stephanie's room. I could hear the distant shout of police officers and the sounds of footsteps rushing through the house. The intruder, realizing the police were closing in, bolted down the stairs. I could hear the heavy thud of his feet as he ran, and for a second, I thought maybe he would get away. But the police had caught him. The man, too desperate to escape, was tackled to the ground on the front lawn. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel like it had just happened. Everything had moved so quickly, and now it was over. The police took the man away. Later, we learned the truth. The man who had broken into Stephanie's house wasn't just a random stranger. He was a serial home invader. He had been circling our house for nearly an hour before he broke in. The footage from the security cameras showed him pacing, watching us through the windows. He had been waiting for the perfect moment. I try not to think about it too much. I try not to imagine what might have happened if we hadn't locked the back door, or if the police hadn't arrived just in time. My name's Marcus. I'm a 27-year-old graphic designer. I work freelance, which means I spend a lot of time on the road. But this job, it was last minute, and honestly, I probably shouldn't have taken it. But money's money, right? I had a rush project in San Diego that I had to get to. It was around 2 a.m., and I was driving down from Northern California. The kind of night where everything feels like it's in slow motion, the highway stretching on endlessly, headlights carving through the darkness. The car had been my only company for hours, and the silence was starting to get to me. I could feel the fatigue pulling at my eyes, each blink growing longer, my body begging me to stop. I hadn't intended on taking a break, but the road was starting to blur together. The coffee I had earlier had long worn off, and all I had left were the low hums of my car's engine and the occasional creak from the seat as I shifted. The highway felt endless, especially at that hour. As the miles passed, I started to notice how quiet it was, not just in my car, but outside too. The only sounds were my tires rolling over the asphalt and the soft buzz of the air conditioning. No crickets, no animals in the distance, just the eerie silence of the road at night. I could see the exit sign for the rest stop about a mile away. I had debated pushing on, but the sleepiness had taken over. I knew I needed to pull over before I ended up making a mistake. My eyes were heavy, my head drooping. It was either stop here or risk falling asleep at the wheel. I decided to stop. I made the turn off the highway, the tires crunching over the gravel as I rolled into the lot. It was mostly empty. There was a single truck parked at the far end, but otherwise the place felt desolate. The only other car was a sedan, parked a little farther from me, its windows fogged up. It looked like someone had been sitting in there for a while. I locked the car and reclined the seat, deciding to take a quick nap. I set the alarm on my phone for 45 minutes. It was a restless kind of sleep, where every little noise makes you jolt awake, only to fall back into a light, fitful doze. I was barely asleep when I started hearing the faint chirping of crickets outside my window. I closed my eyes again. The breeze outside whistled, rustling the leaves of the trees. The lot was still. But eventually I slipped into a deeper sleep, trusting that the alarm would wake me up in time. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I woke up. I thought I'd heard something faint. The soft crunching of gravel like someone was walking. I groggily opened my eyes, blinking against the harsh light of the dashboard. I glanced at the clock. It read 3:04 a.m. But it wasn't the alarm that had woken me up. It was the sound. The gravel. Someone was walking on it, close to my car. Really close. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I laid perfectly still, trying to keep my body from reacting. I couldn't move. I could hear every shift in my body, involuntary twitch of my fingers, every heartbeat pounding in my ears. I could feel the cold sweat beginning to form on my neck. I could hear the gravel underfoot. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to sneak up on me. And that's when I realized it wasn't just someone walking by. Someone was outside. They were walking right by my car. My eyes flickered to the side mirror. At first, all I saw was darkness. But then I saw him. A man, crouched low, just on the other side of my passenger door. His silhouette was hard to make out, but I could tell he was watching me. His movements were slow, calculated, like he was testing the boundaries, waiting for me to make a sound. I felt my heartbeat spike in my chest. Panic was starting to creep in. I had to do something, but my body was paralyzed. I just kept staring at him through the mirror, my mind racing, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. I glanced toward the door. The handle, it was locked. But this didn't feel like a random person. This wasn't a guy walking by. Then, he reached for the handle, tugging it gently. No real force, just a little test. The sound of the handle rattling. Locked. A small sense of relief flooded through me. But it was short-lived. He didn't move away. He just stood there for a second, his fingers lingering on the handle. Then, without warning, he started moving around my car, his footsteps light but deliberate, like he was taking his time. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The man was now on the driver's side, close enough that I could see the faint outline of his face in the dim light. It was hard to make out details, but the outline of his hoodie, pulled up tight, was unmistakable. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but I could see the shape of his eyes, wide and intent, scanning the car. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears, and then, bang! His fist slammed against the window, hard. The shock of the sound made me jump. I barely caught my breath before his fingers started jabbing at the handle, trying it over and over again, as though he was trying to get in no matter what. It was too much. I don't know how I did it, but instinct kicked in. My hands fumbled for the ignition, and I threw the car into gear, the engine roaring to life. The tires screeched as I slammed my foot on the gas, fishtailing out of the parking lot. I didn't even look back. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the steering wheel. I glanced at the rearview mirror. No sign of him. I drove like a maniac for what felt like an eternity, but I couldn't stop shaking. My eyes kept darting to the rear view, half expecting to see headlights trailing me, or him, his dark figure, lurking in the shadows behind me, but nothing followed. I didn't know if I was being paranoid, but I didn't stop until I found a gas station 30 miles down the road. My hands were still trembling when I pulled in. My breath was ragged as I stepped out of the car, my legs wobbly. The gas station was quiet, but it felt like the safest place I'd seen in hours. I wasn't just lucky. I was alive. I never stopped at a rest stop again. I grew up in a small town in rural Texas, surrounded by miles of open land. You get used to the isolation after a while. The kind of quiet where you can hear the wind move through the grass and feel the heavy, thick air pressing down on everything. As a kid, it never bothered me. I spent hours outside, running through the dirt roads and climbing trees, finding ways to occupy my time. But that summer, I was 17, and it was different. I'd been sent to my grandfather's farm for the summer. My mom thought it would do me good to get away from the city, spend time with the old man. I wasn't exactly thrilled at first, but I didn't complain. It was, after all, just a couple of months. I knew the drill. The farm was old, weathered, and a little rundown, but it had a strange charm about it. The farmhouse creaked when the wind blew, the barn doors barely hung on their hinges, but everything worked. For the most part, anyway. What really struck me was how hot it was that summer. I'm used to heat in Texas, but this felt like something else. The sun hung low in the sky every day, and there was always this haze that made everything look faded, like you were living in an old photograph. You could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on you, making you feel sluggish. I tried to keep busy, mostly by jogging. There was this dirt road that ran through my grandfather's land, cutting straight through the middle of the property. On either side of the road, endless fields of corn stretched out, tall and thick. It was quiet here. I would run the same stretch of road every day, letting the sweat soak through my t-shirt. That evening, like most evenings, I set out for my usual jog. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting everything in a golden hue. The sky was painted orange, turning the cornfields into what looked like walls of fire on either side of me. I could feel the sweat running down my neck as I picked up my pace, my feet kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The road was empty, as it usually was, and the silence around me was almost unnerving. It wasn't the quiet of nature, more like the quiet of being far away from everything. My footsteps echoed against the stillness, and the occasional rustle of a cornstalk shifting in the breeze was the only sound. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I didn't stop. I was too used to this kind of isolation to be scared of it. That's when I heard it. The sound of a truck coming up the road behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. I was so used to the occasional vehicle passing through the road that it barely registered in my mind. But the sound of the engine was different, rougher, like the truck had been through a lot of wear and tear. It sputtered and rumbled, the kind of truck you'd expect to see on a farm, but it was coming toward me slowly. I turned my head, wiping sweat off my forehead, and saw it. A beat-up old pickup, covered in dust, with two men inside. The truck slowed to a crawl as it approached me, and the driver rolled down the window. I didn't know what to think at first, but something about the way he looked at me made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Hey there, kid," the driver called out, his voice gravely. His eyes were shaded under the brim of a worn-out baseball cap, and his face was rough, like someone who'd spent too many years working under the harsh Texas sun. "You out here all alone?" I stopped running. I wiped my brow again, trying to look casual. There was something in his tone that made me uneasy, but I didn't want to act like I was scared. "Yeah," I said, shrugging a little. "Just getting some exercise." The other man, sitting in the passenger seat, leaned over and asked in a voice that was even colder, "Anyone know you're out here?" I felt a chill run through me. Of course, I was alone. I didn't have anyone with me. But the way he asked it, like he was testing me, made my stomach twist. I smiled, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just out for a jog." The driver smiled back. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than it should have, and the way he looked at me made me feel like I was suddenly prey, something vulnerable. Without warning, the passenger door of the truck swung open. The man stepped out of the truck, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that echoed in the heavy silence. My heart skipped a beat. Before I could even think, instinct took over. I turned and bolted into the cornfield. The cornfield was dense, thick and tall, the stalks reaching up higher than my head. As soon as I ran into it, I was surrounded. The noise of the truck faded behind me, but the sound of my footsteps crunching through the dry earth and the rustling of the corn filled the air. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the men's voices, louder now, angrier as they shouted at each other. I pushed through the rows of corn, my arms scraping against the sharp edges of the stalks. They cut into my skin, and I could feel the blood trickling down my arms and legs, but I didn't stop. I could hear their heavy footsteps behind me, the snap of twigs under their boots as they chased after me, their voices getting closer. I pushed harder, running faster, but it was impossible to tell where I was going. The cornfield was a labyrinth, every row looking the same, every turn leading to more twists and turns. I kept my head down, barely breathing, trying to keep the sound of my footsteps muffled. My legs were already aching, but there was no way I could slow down. Time felt like it slowed to a crawl. I tried to push the panic from my mind, telling myself that I could get out of this, that I just needed to keep moving. But the more I ran, the more the stalks seemed to close in around me, like they were closing off all my exits. I crouched low, hoping they wouldn't hear me. My breath was ragged now, my chest heaving with each intake of air. I could hear them moving through the field, their voices rising and falling in the distance. They were close now, But just as quickly as the sounds had grown louder, they faded. The footsteps slowed and the voices started to disappear into the distance. I held my breath, straining to hear. There was no sound, no movement. Had they given up? I couldn't be sure. Carefully, cautiously, I started to move again. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't afford to stop. I pushed forward through the corn, taking careful steps, making sure I wasn't making any noise. I didn't know which way I was going, but I kept moving, hoping that I would find some way out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the dirt road again. The dark outline of the road appeared through the rows of corn, and I almost felt like I was dreaming. I didn't stop to think. I stumbled toward the road, my feet dragging, my body barely able to keep moving. The sun was nearly gone now, the sky turning dark with the first signs of twilight. I had never been so glad to see the road. I stumbled onto the gravel, my body shaking with exhaustion, the adrenaline starting to wear off. A car was coming down the road. I didn't hesitate. I waved my arms frantically, stumbling toward it. "Please stop!" I shouted, my voice raw and hoarse from running. The car slowed down, coming to a stop in front of me. I could barely make out the shape of a woman in the driver's seat. She rolled down the window, and when she saw me, her eyes went wide with recognition. "Mason?" she asked, her voice surprised but kind. "Miss Jeanette, the woman who worked at the diner back in town." She was older, maybe in her 50s, but I'd seen her around enough to know who she was. I didn't have the strength to explain. I didn't have the energy to do anything but collapse into the passenger seat. "Please, take me home," I gasped. Without a second thought, she unlocked the door, and I climbed into the car, my legs barely able to hold me up. The ride back to my grandfather's farm was quiet. I couldn't stop shaking. When we got to the farmhouse, the sheriff was already there. They did a quick search of the area, but there was no sign of the truck, no sign of the men. They asked me questions, but I couldn't answer them. My mind was still reeling, trying to process what had happened. The only things left behind were a discarded beer can and deep footprints in the cornfield. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. And the next day, when I went outside to get some fresh air, I couldn't bring myself to go anywhere near the cornfields. My name is Eric. I live in a small town in Northern California, and I'm the kind of person who likes to keep to myself. I'm in my mid-30s, work a desk job in a graphic design firm, and I spend most of my free time on the couch scrolling through social media or binge-watching shows. I don't go out much, don't get involved in anything dramatic, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I prefer the simplicity of routine. That routine, however, got completely upended last summer when my aunt asked if I could help clean out my late uncle's house. He had passed away a few months earlier after a long battle with illness, and his place in Sacramento had been sitting untouched ever since. My aunt couldn't bring herself to go through it all. Too many memories, she said. So she called me, the only one in the family with a little time to spare. At first, I was hesitant. It's not like I was especially close to my uncle. He was one of those people who kept to himself, who never seemed interested in family events or even in keeping up with his nephews and nieces. I hadn't seen him in years, and when I was younger, I always thought he was a little odd. But he wasn't a bad guy. Quiet, introverted, and with a dry sense of humor, but harmless. Still, I wasn't exactly excited about cleaning out his house, especially since it meant I had to drive an hour or so to Sacramento every other day. But after a few weeks of ignoring her calls, I finally agreed. She needed help, and I needed something to keep my mind off everything else. The house was a small, nondescript ranch-style home tucked away on a quiet, tree-lined street. You'd never guess it was in a city like Sacramento. This part of town had the feeling of an old neighborhood that had been bypassed by time. The houses were aging, the lawns a little too overgrown, The place had a forgotten, lived-in quality, like it hadn't been touched in decades. When I first walked inside, the air hit me like a wall. It smelled of dust, mildew, and something else, something sharp and old. The kind of smell you get from books that have sat on a shelf for too long. I kicked off my shoes and stood in the entryway, taking it all in. The house was cluttered with old furniture, piles of papers, and knickknacks. Everywhere I looked, there was something. Faded family photos, books that seemed untouched for years, and odd little trinkets that must have meant something to him. But it felt like the house itself didn't quite want me there, as though it were waiting for someone else. I set my bag down and began my work. I was supposed to sort through the things, organize them for donation, and pack up anything my aunt wanted to keep. The first few days were uneventful. I spent hours going through boxes of old clothes, emptying cabinets, and throwing away things I knew no one would ever use. But there was something about the house. It wasn't a creepy feeling, just a strange, persistent sensation that made the hairs on my neck prickle every now and then. A weird heaviness in the air, like I wasn't quite alone. The house had a basement. It wasn't much, just a small set of stairs leading down to a dusty, dimly lit room. The floor was concrete, and there were piles of old furniture stacked along the walls, tables, chairs, an old mattress, and some cardboard boxes filled with who knows what. On the second day, I found something strange. Beneath a pile of old magazines and a dusty sheet, there was a radio. It was a vintage, wood-paneled model, the kind you'd expect to see in an old black-and-white movie. The knobs were silver and a little tarnished. The speaker cloth was faded and torn in places. It was still plugged in, but it wasn't on. I thought that was odd. My uncle hadn't been a tech guy, not by any means. Most of the house was filled with old furniture and knickknacks from decades ago. Why had this radio been left plugged in? I didn't think much of it at the time, though. I figured it was just another relic of my uncle's time. Maybe he liked listening to it while working on something, but then forgot to turn it off. Whatever the reason, it didn't bother me. I just left it where it was, figuring I'd deal with it later. By the fourth day, I had made a dent in things. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. The house had this oppressive stillness to it. It wasn't that I was scared, but I felt uneasy. The longer I stayed in the house, the more that feeling grew. That night, I decided to stay over. I didn't want to make the long drive back to my apartment after a full day of cleaning. The air in the house was too thick to ignore, but I was too tired to leave. The darkness outside was suffocating, and the only light inside was from a single lamp in the living room. I tried to relax with a book, but the silence was deafening. No hum of a refrigerator, no distant sounds of traffic, just silence. It felt wrong, somehow. At around 2 a.m, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible buzz. I thought I was imagining things, so I ignored it, but the buzzing got louder. It sounded like static on a radio, and it was coming from the living room. I froze, my mind racing. I'm sure it was nothing. I told myself it was just the house settling or some appliance kicking on. But then, after a few more seconds, I heard it. A voice. A low, muffled whisper that seemed to come from the radio in the living room. Eric. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. I could hear my name. It wasn't clear, but it was unmistakable. I didn't want to get out of bed. I really didn't, but I couldn't just ignore it either. The room was so still, the air so thick, that I felt like I might suffocate if I didn't check. I got out of bed and made my way down the hallway. Every creak of the floorboards felt like it echoed in the silence. The living room was dark, except for the glow of the streetlights outside that filtered through the curtains. The radio was sitting there on the coffee table, exactly where I'd left it, but it was on now. The dial was tuned to static, and the voice, my name, kept repeating. Eric? I approached it slowly, like I was approaching a wild animal. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't want to touch it either. I had no idea how it had turned on. I just knew I needed it to stop. I grabbed the cord and yanked it out of the wall. For a moment, there was silence. Sweet, blessed silence. But it didn't last long. The voice came back, louder now, clearer. Eric? I froze. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was in the room. The air seemed to vibrate with it. My hands shook as I backed away from the radio, my mind scrambling to understand what was happening. The voice sounded like it was right behind me. I turned around in a panic, but the room was empty. Nothing but the flickering shadows cast by the dim streetlights. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed the radio and threw it in my bag, hoping that would make it stop. But I could still hear it, that whispering voice. No matter how far I walked away, it followed me. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of prank? But no one else was in the house with me. No one could have done this. And yet I couldn't explain it. The next day I decided I needed to get rid of the radio. It was ridiculous, I knew that, but something in me snapped. It had to go. I packed it up in the trunk of my car and drove to the nearest dump. The entire drive, the voice followed me. Every few minutes I'd hear it faintly, like it was coming from the speakers of the car. When I finally reached the dump, I pulled over, grabbed the radio, and threw it in a bin. But as I stood there, I heard it again. My name. Clear as day. I snapped. I was done. I left the radio there. But when I got back in the car, I checked my phone, and that's when I saw it. A voicemail. No number, just a voicemail. I opened it. The voice was louder now. Eric. It was no longer just static. It was there in my phone, like it was coming from the speaker. I drove home that night, but I didn't go back to the house the next day, and I haven't been back since. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I don't care. Whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting, and I'm not going back to find out. I've never been much of an outdoorsy person. Hiking, camping, even just spending time outside, it was all a bit too much for me. I preferred the comfort of my couch, the quiet hum of city life, and the control of my surroundings. But when I moved to Austin, Texas, I figured I should at least try to get a little more involved with the local scene. Everyone talked about the beauty of the Texas hill country, the sprawling forests, the hidden gems of trails, so I decided to give it a shot. I'd heard good things about the Lost Pine Trails. They were supposedly easy, meant for beginners, and a way to get a taste of the nature around here without feeling like you were about to get lost in the wilderness. The idea of walking through nature and getting a little fresh air seemed like a nice way to spend an afternoon. Plus, it wasn't too far from the city, just a short drive, really. So I figured, why not? I parked my car at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. The sun was still pretty high in the sky, but the shade of the trees was cool and inviting, so it felt like the perfect time to start. The air had that dry, almost dusty quality to it, common in Texas, but there was a slight breeze that made it more bearable. I grabbed my water bottle, adjusted my backpack, and took my first steps onto the trail. The Lost Pine Trails were exactly as advertised. Easy, well-marked, and full of those beautiful tall pine trees that I'd read about. The kind that made the air smell fresh with that pine-scented sweetness mixed with the earthy underbrush. It was peaceful. Quiet, really. The trail was wide enough that I didn't feel boxed in by the trees, but still narrow enough to give that cozy, isolated feeling. I kept walking, my shoes crunching against the dirt path, taking in the scenery. The further I went, the more the city sounds faded away. It was like the hustle and bustle of Austin had been swallowed up by the forest. At the last rest stop, just a little ways into the trail, I ran into a small group of locals sitting on a bench. They were chatting and eating snacks. Just regular folks, enjoying a break on a Saturday afternoon. They looked like they were in their mid-30s, maybe a little older. I overheard one of them talking about how great the Lost Pine Trine trails were for beginners, so I figured I'd ask them for advice. I walked over to the bench, offering a friendly smile. "Hey, I'm new to the area. Is this trail all right for a beginner?" I asked. One of the guys looked up, a friendly smile spreading across his face. "Oh yeah, it's perfect for someone just getting into hiking. Not too steep, mostly flat." He paused, glancing at the others, then added with a grin, "But if you're looking for something more exciting, you could take a shortcut through the woods. Cuts the trip down by an hour and the scenery's a lot better." "Really?" I asked, intrigued. "I've only got a couple of hours, so that sounds pretty good." He nodded. "It's a bit off the beaten path, but it's easy enough to follow. Trust me, you won't miss it. You'll see the way once you head off the main trail. You're good." I thought about it for a moment. The idea of saving time, seeing some different sights, maybe avoiding a crowded trail, it seemed harmless enough. Plus, I hadn't really planned out how long I'd be out here, so the thought of cutting some time off sounded appealing. "All right, thanks," I said, feeling pretty confident in my decision. I waved goodbye and started down the trail in the direction they'd indicated. At first, everything went fine. The trail curved off from the main path, winding its way through the trees. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the air had that earthy smell of pine and damp soil. The trail wasn't hard to follow, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction knowing I was doing something off the beaten path. But after about 20 minutes, things started to change. The brush began to get thicker. The trees around me closed in, the path narrowing, forcing me to step over fallen logs and duck under branches. I had to brush aside some low-hanging pine needles that scratched at my arms, and the further I went, the more I realized that the trail wasn't as clear as I'd thought. The foliage was dense now, almost swallowing the path entirely. Was this still the shortcut? Had I missed something? I slowed down, scanning the ground, looking for any sign that I was still on the right track, but everything seemed wrong. There were no more markers or signs, just trees and thick underbrush. The occasional snap of a twig underfoot, the sound of a distant bird call. The silence was pressing in on me now. I hesitated, checking my phone to see if I had service. There was a faint signal, but nothing reliable enough to trust for directions. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I kept going. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I thought I could still find my way. Suddenly, the path just stopped. No gradual fade, no detour. It just vanished. The ground ahead of me was choked with thick roots, brambles, and vines. The earth was loose, uneven, and I couldn't see any clear way forward. I froze for a moment, my mind racing. How had I missed it? I turned around, hoping to backtrack, but the path I'd come from was equally overgrown. I had only taken a few steps before my foot sank into the ground and the earth beneath me gave way. My body lurched forward and I tumbled, unable to stop myself. My ankle twisted in a painful snap as I fell, and I cried out involuntarily. The world spun and I landed with a sickening thud in a small depression in the earth, a hidden sinkhole that I hadn't seen. The world around me went dark for a moment, and then I was left with nothing but the dull ache in my ankle. I tried to move, but the pain shot through my leg like a fire. My breath hitched, my chest tightening in panic. I wasn't going anywhere. Not on my own, not with an ankle that felt like it was about to snap in half. My eyes frantically searched for any sign of help, but the silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. Then I heard something. It was a rustling sound, faint at first, coming from somewhere above me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I held my breath. Was it another hiker? Someone who could help me? I waited for a moment, trying to listen closer. But then there was another sound, a subtle shifting of leaves like something was moving around the trees. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. It wasn't another hiker, it was something else. I tried to shift, propping myself up on my arms, glancing through the foliage in the direction of the sound. There, in the trees, I caught a glimpse of something. Two pairs of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkening light. They were low, crouched. The eyes blinked slowly, and my stomach churned. Coyotes. I knew it. I'd heard about the wild coyotes that lived around these parts. It wasn't common for them to attack humans, but a hungry pack, that was a different story. And I was alone, helpless. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking uncontrollably as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light was weak, but it was something. I waved it around, desperately trying to shine it toward the trail. Maybe someone would see. Maybe someone would hear. Then I saw it. Another set of glowing eyes, and another. They were coming closer, creeping through the brush. My breath caught in my throat. They were circling, getting closer, always staying just beyond the reach of the light. I tried to keep my panic in check. I focused on my phone, aiming the beam of light higher, hoping that the beam would travel far enough to catch someone's attention. But as the seconds ticked by, it felt like the world was closing in around me. The growls, low, rumbling, guttural, filled the air. I couldn't move. The pain in my ankle was too much, and I was alone, surrounded by these hungry animals with no one to help me. And then, just when it seemed like everything was about to spiral completely out of control, I heard a voice. "Hey, you okay?" It took a second for my brain to process the words. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But no. I could see the lights of headlamps cutting through the trees, and then two figures appeared through the brush. Two guys, both in their 20s, probably, were making their way toward me, their headlamps flashing through the darkening woods. The coyotes, sensing the approaching human presence, scattered in an instant. They were gone before I could even breathe a sigh of relief. The hikers rushed to my side, one of them kneeling down beside me as the other stood, scanning the area, ensuring no animals were lurking. They didn't waste time with small talk. The guy who knelt beside me immediately helped me onto my feet, carefully avoiding putting weight on my injured ankle. "Easy," he said gently, his voice calming. "We've got you." They supported me as I hobbled, one arm around each of their shoulders. Every step was agony, but I was just so thankful to be out of the danger zone. The flashlight beams ahead of us sliced through the trees, guiding our way back to the main trail. I didn't say much. I couldn't. I was too shaken up, but as we made our way back, I couldn't help but think how close I had come to something much worse. The woods weren't just a peaceful escape. We finally made it to the main trail, the lights of the parking lot just a few hundred yards away. The shortcut I had taken hadn't saved me time. It had almost cost me everything. I would never take that path again. Never again. It started like any other night. My best friend Chris and I, both 16, were at my house in this quiet little suburban neighborhood in California. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving the place all to ourselves. There's something about having the house to yourself when you're a teenager. Total freedom, no rules, just a fridge stocked with snacks, a few horror movies on deck, and hours ahead of us. Around 10:30 p.m., we started our movie marathon. Chris was the kind of guy who could watch anything and still enjoy it, but tonight we were going for cheesy slasher films, the kind with awful acting, predictable plots, and ridiculous over-the-top deaths. We loved it. There was something comforting about it, and the way the stupid characters ran into all the worst situations made it easy to forget how quiet the house was. The silence between the movie scenes seemed to stretch on forever, only broken by the occasional crunch of popcorn. As the night wore on, Chris's stomach growled loudly, making us both laugh. "Dude, I need some chips or I'm going to pass out," he said, his voice muffled by the blanket he had wrapped around himself on the couch. "All right, I got you," I replied, heading to the kitchen. The house was dark except for the flickering glow of the TV, and the hallway light felt miles away as I walked through the living room. The fridge door creaked open, and I pulled out a half-empty bag of chips, shaking them around a bit to get to the crunchy bits at the bottom. The sound of the crunching bag filled the quiet of the house. Suddenly, I heard Chris shout from the other room, "Yo, James, who's at the door?" I froze, my hand still in the bag of chips. Who could be here at this time? It was already after midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. No one should be here. Not at this hour. I quickly set the chips down on the counter, my mind racing. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked toward the front door. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch. He was wearing a brown delivery uniform. Nothing too out of the ordinary at first glance. But something was off. The way he stood, it wasn't like the usual delivery drivers who were used to making quick stops. He was shifting from one foot to the other like he was nervous. His eyes kept darting down the street, and his posture looked strained. There was something about his presence that just didn't sit right with me. I glanced at my phone, but there were no delivery notifications, no messages. I wasn't expecting any packages. Chris's voice came from behind me, quiet but tinged with suspicion. "We didn't order anything, right?" I shook my head slowly. "Nope. Not a thing." I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling creeping into my chest. I cleared my throat and called out through the door. "Wrong house, man. We didn't order anything." For a moment, there was no answer. I watched through the peephole, the dim light from the porch casting a strange shadow over the man's face. His hand was holding a medium-sized package, but there was something odd about how he was gripping it. His fingers were stiff. I couldn't figure out why, but it gave me an odd sense of unease. And then the man pressed the doorbell again. This time the sound was louder, more insistent. It echoed through the house, reverberating in the quiet of the night. I turned back to Chris. "Weird, right?" Chris looked at me, his face already pale. "Yeah, man, something's not right." "Call the cops?" I asked, but before he could respond, the man outside pressed the doorbell again, this time even harder. I looked through the peephole again. I saw something that froze me completely. The man's left hand was holding the package, but in his other hand, there was something else. A flash of metal. A crowbar. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. Chris saw the look on my face, and his eyes went wide. "Dude, he's got a crowbar," I whispered. Just then, the man's gaze shifted, and I saw his eyes dart around the street once more. His body tensed, and that's when I noticed the second figure. A shadow just out of view. Someone standing along the side of the house, hidden in the dark. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could tell they were there. Before I could even react, the man slammed his shoulder into the door with such force that the whole house shook. The door frame creaked, and I felt the wood splintering slightly under the pressure. I had to move quickly. "Shit!" I hissed, grabbing the doorknob and throwing my weight against the door. The man on the other side grunted, his body slamming against the door again, this time harder than before. Chris stumbled back, his face going ghost white. "James, what the hell is happening?" His voice cracked, full of panic. I didn't have time to explain. I threw myself against the door again. I glanced down at the door frame. Already the lock was starting to give way under the pressure. The man on the other side was grunting, trying to force his crowbar between the door and the frame. "Come on, boys. Open up," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. The words didn't match the urgency of his actions. I glanced around the room, looking for anything I could use to buy us more time. My eyes landed on the lamp on the side table. "Chris," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "throw that lamp." "What?" He blinked, clearly stunned. "Throw it." Chris didn't hesitate. He grabbed the lamp and with one swift motion threw it at the door. The glass shattered against the wood with a deafening crash, and the man outside faltered just for a second. That second was enough. I threw my shoulder into the door, pressing all my weight against it as the lock clicked into place. My heart was hammering in my chest, but somehow we had bought ourselves a moment. We stood there, holding our breath, waiting for any sign of movement. But the man didn't try to break in again. Chris fumbled with his phone, dialing 911 with shaky fingers. "Please, please pick up," he muttered under his breath as the line rang. When the dispatcher finally answered, Chris quickly explained what had happened. I stood next to him, my ear pressed to the door, trying to listen for any sounds from the other side. But there was nothing, not a single noise. Moments later, the police arrived with sirens blaring, lighting up the dark street in a flashing array of red and blue. They came in fast, securing the perimeter of the house. I could hear their voices outside, giving instructions, making sure everything was clear. I stood there, still staring at the door. The police did a sweep of the neighborhood, checking the street, the yards, and even the alleyway behind the house. But there was no sign of the delivery man or the second figure. No van, no car, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. One of them said, "We've had reports from neighboring areas. Fake delivery drivers trying to break into homes, particularly where young people are living alone." We watched as the officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, speaking with neighbors, but no one had seen anything unusual. They had no leads, no van to trace, no description of the second figure. Nothing. And just like that, the incident faded into the background of our lives. No arrests, no closure. Weeks passed. Life slowly returned to normal, but every time the doorbell rang late at night, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't help it. My mind kept going back to that moment. The crowbar, the man's calm voice, the second figure waiting in the dark. We never saw them again. But the fear lingered. It wasn't unusual for me to crave some time away from everything. I've always been someone who finds peace in solitude, but not too much solitude, just enough to disconnect, clear my mind, and breathe without the noise of daily life. So when my aunt asked me to look after the family's cabin for a weekend, I jumped at the chance. It's located in the northern hills of California, not far from a small town called Ashford Pines. I'd been there plenty of times as a kid, but I hadn't been back in years. The cabin itself is pretty old, a relic from the 1970s, but it's been maintained over the years and holds a lot of memories. Surrounded by thick pines and high ridges, it's isolated, sitting about a 20-minute drive from the nearest neighbors. There's something comforting about it. When you step outside, all you hear is the wind rustling through the trees and the faint chirping of crickets and night creatures. There's a sort of stillness that feels almost like the world is far, far away, out of reach. I drove up late Friday afternoon, the road winding through hills and forests, the sky tinged with the pinks and oranges of a setting sun. When I pulled up to the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. I unpacked my things and set the place up for the weekend. It felt good to be there, to be away from the hustle of my usual life. The crackle of the fire, the scent of burning cedar, and the low hum of wind through the trees, it all made everything feel cozy and safe. As the sky darkened, I got comfortable on the worn leather couch in front of the fire. I opened a book and tried to lose myself in its pages, the crackling fire adding a rhythm to my thoughts. The wind outside was picking up, a gust brushing the trees and making the cabin creak. I didn't think much of it. I was used to that. This place was old, and it made noises sometimes, especially on windy nights. I lost track of time, the hours slipping by unnoticed. Then around 10:30 p.m., something made me pause. A soft, almost tentative knock echoed from the back door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but when it came again, a little louder, a little more deliberate, I stood up and walked over to the door, confused. I checked the window beside it, but there was nothing to see. Frowning, I stepped outside and looked around, but the yard was completely still. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees in the wind. I felt a prickle of unease. Maybe it was some curious animal or a stray cat pawing at the door, though it didn't quite sound like that. I went back inside, locked the door again, and tried to shake it off. But my mind wasn't quite settled. The cabin was so isolated. Who would be out here at this hour, knocking on the door like that? I kept thinking about it, my mind returning to that strange knock every few minutes. I tried to focus on my book again, but it was hard. The stillness of the place, the isolation, seemed to grow heavier. I decided to make some tea, hoping the warm drink would settle my nerves. As I poured the boiling water into my mug, my eyes glanced back out the window at the yard. That's when I saw it. Muddy boot prints in the soft ground outside. They weren't just a few steps, but a full circle around the cabin, over and over again. My heart began to race. There was no way anyone had walked through the mud earlier. I had checked when I arrived. Everything had been quiet. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside, cautiously walking around the cabin, my breath visible in the chilly night air. The footprints were clear, deep, like someone had been pacing around the cabin, waiting. Was someone out here? Someone who had been watching? I quickly locked the back door and made sure the windows were secure again. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't see anyone, but the prints were unmistakable. They weren't fresh exactly, but they'd definitely been made that night. It was then I decided I should call the sheriff's office. It seemed like the right thing to do, even if nothing had happened yet. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if I should be taking it more seriously. But after the knock and the prints, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I called the number for the local sheriff's department. The dispatcher answered, her voice calm but with an edge of concern when I explained the situation. "Ma'am, it's going to take about an hour for anyone to get out there. Are you safe inside?" "Yeah, I'm inside. Everything's locked up, but there's something odd. Footprints around the cabin, and I heard someone knock at the door." "Stay inside and don't open the door for anyone, okay?" she said, her voice firm. "Do you see anyone right now?" "No," I said, glancing around. "I haven't seen anyone, but I'm worried there's someone outside." "Understandable. Just stay put. We'll get someone out there soon, but it'll take a while." I hung up and tried to settle in again. I grabbed a blanket and wrapped myself in it, my eyes darting to the windows, then back to the fire. The sound of the wind outside seemed to grow louder, the trees creaking and swaying. But then I heard it, a soft, crunching sound. My heart stopped. It was too deliberate to be an animal. Someone was out there, walking around the back of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again. They circled the cabin, just like the prints outside. My pulse quickened. What the hell was going on? I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 again, but this time I didn't have to explain much. The dispatcher's voice was already laced with urgency. "Stay inside, ma'am. We're sending someone out as fast as we can." I stayed on the line with her, whispering, "Someone's outside. I can hear them walking around. Don't engage. Lock up everything and stay hidden. Do not open the door for anyone." I felt trapped. I couldn't just sit there. I checked the locks on all the windows, then pulled the curtains shut. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were trembling and the silence around me felt suffocating. And then it happened. A shadow passed the living room window, flitting by so fast I almost didn't see it. But I did. Someone was outside. I backed away from the window, my heart thundering in my chest. I was frozen for a second, not sure what to do. Then the scraping sound came from the back door. Someone was trying to open the window, prying at it with something. My breath hitched. In a panic, I bolted upstairs to the attic, hiding myself in the small crawl space behind the rafters. The space was cramped and cold, but I didn't care. I just needed to be hidden. My phone was clutched in my hand, and I whispered my updates into it, my voice shaking. I could hear the intruder downstairs, moving through the cabin, rummaging through the kitchen, opening drawers, tea, and pulling things out. The creaking of the floorboards was too loud. They were getting closer to the stairs, to where I was hiding. I pressed my back against the cold, splintered wood of the attic, barely breathing, as I listened to the footsteps coming closer. It felt like an eternity before the sheriff's deputies arrived, but it was probably only about 45 minutes. My body was trembling with cold and fear, my thoughts swirling in a haze of panic. Every small noise outside, every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I stayed as quiet as I could, trying to control my breathing. When I finally heard the sheriff's voice downstairs, I couldn't help but exhale in relief. I climbed down from the crawl space and crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The door was still wide open, and the lights from the sheriff's cars outside illuminated the house in an eerie glow. Deputies were already inside, looking around. One of them was at the back door, examining the locks, while another checked the windows. The place had been trashed, drawers were opened and emptied, the contents scattered across the floor. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaky. I could barely look at the mess. "We found signs of forced entry," the deputy said, his voice calm but concerned. "Looks like whoever did this was trying to get in, but they left when they heard us coming." "There's no sign they were here for long," he said, scratching his head. "We believe the man who's been staying in an abandoned cabin about a mile from here was casing properties. We think he was looking for a place to rob. Your cabin was just one of several he had been watching." I felt my heart sink. "So, it's over? They're gone?" "For now," he said, his face grim. "We've got patrols out looking for him, but he's probably long gone by now." I nodded numbly. By the time the sheriff's deputies left, it was close to dawn. The sky had lightened slightly, but the woods outside felt just as dark as they had when I first arrived. I packed up my things early the next morning, too rattled to stay. The sun had barely risen, but I couldn't bear to be in the cabin any longer. I drove back to the city as quickly as I could, the roads winding through the quiet hills. I don't know if it's the isolation or the fear of being alone out there again, but I can't bring myself to return to that cabin. Not after what happened. The idea that someone had been watching, waiting, pacing around my home while I was inside, completely unaware. It still haunts me. I think about it often, and I don't think I'll ever be able to feel safe in such an isolated place again. My name is Daniel, and this happened a few years ago. I was 17 years old, and my parents decided that I needed to spend a few weeks at my Uncle Rick's farm in rural Texas. The reason? Well, I was supposed to help with the corn harvest. It was supposed to be simple. Get away from the city, help out, and maybe even get a break from my usual routine. But it turned into something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I didn't really know what to expect from my uncle's farm. I had visited a few times before when I was younger, but this time was different. Uncle Rick's farm was out in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any kind of civilization. The nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away, and the landscape was just endless stretches of cornfields and dense woods. The only sounds you'd hear out there were the wind rustling through the crops and the occasional chirp of a bird. When I first arrived, everything seemed fine. Uncle Rick was a tough, quiet guy, but he was friendly enough. He showed me around, pointing out the areas that needed the most attention, like the barns and the fields. I was put to work immediately. The days were long, and the heat was unbearable. Texas summers are no joke. The sun beat down relentlessly, and I often felt like I was baking out there in the fields. I'd drive the tractor, try to keep the crops neat, and just generally help with whatever needed doing. At night, Uncle Rick and I would have dinner, and then I'd go to bed early, exhausted from the work. But there was one night near the end of my stay that I'll never forget. It started when I was out closing up the barn. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the fields. I was just about done locking up the last of the barn doors when I noticed something strange. Out in the cornfield, I thought I saw a figure, just standing there, halfway hidden between the stalks, barely visible. I squinted, trying to make it out. It was too far away to see clearly, but I could tell it was human-shaped. I figured it was just my eyes playing tricks on me from exhaustion. I had been working all day, and the heat was getting to me. The wind made the corn sway, and maybe the way they moved just made it look like there was someone standing there. I shrugged it off. After all, there was no one else around for miles. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I hurried inside the house, locking the door behind me. Uncle Rick was watching TV in the living room, and I tried to act normal, but I couldn't get that figure out of my mind. I didn't say anything to Uncle Rick. I didn't want to sound crazy. But when I went to bed that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could picture was that figure standing out there in the cornfield, just staring at the house. The next night, I woke up in the middle of the night, parched. My throat was dry, and I could feel the heat from the day still trapped in the walls. I stumbled out of bed, trying not to make too much noise, and headed for the kitchen to grab a glass of water. The house was completely dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. The kitchen had this cold, empty feeling to it. And I swear I could hear every creak of the floorboards under my feet as I walked. I filled my glass and took a sip, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been hanging over me since I saw that figure. I was about to head back to bed when I froze. From the kitchen window, I could see the cornfield stretching out into the distance. And there, right at the edge of the field, was the figure again. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. It was standing still, not moving, and facing the house. I could see it more clearly now. It was a person, tall and thin, with a dark silhouette that seemed almost unnatural against the moonlit field. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood there, frozen, my hands still clutching the glass of water. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was just someone passing through. But the way the figure just stood there, unmoving, staring toward the house, it felt wrong. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like lead, and I could barely breathe as I watched the figure. It didn't move for what felt like forever. I had this overwhelming urge to look away, but I couldn't. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like hours. I knew I needed to wake up Uncle Rick, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Finally, I ran into Uncle Rick's room and shook him awake. He wasn't happy about being woken up, but when I told him about the figure, he seemed to snap into action. We went to the window together, and he stared out into the dark fields. But by the time we got there, the figure was gone. Vanished without a trace. I couldn't believe it. Was I imagining it? Uncle Rick didn't say much, but after a minute, he grabbed his phone and called the local sheriff. I had no idea what was going on, but he seemed really serious now. The next morning, the sheriff and his deputies showed up at the farm. They were a little gruff, but they took Uncle Rick's concerns seriously. They said they'd sweep the field, make sure there wasn't anything suspicious going on. We all walked out to the cornfield, the sheriff leading the way. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows over the rows of corn. The air was thick with humidity, and the ground felt soft under my boots, like the earth was still trying to hold on to the heat of the night. It was dead quiet, except for the occasional rustling of corn stalks in the breeze. We walked deep into the field, the rows stretching on and on. Then, suddenly, one of the deputies called out. He'd found something. Tucked away in a hidden spot, deep within the corn maze, there was a small camp. A tarp was stretched out over some old branches, and there were bags of stolen supplies scattered around. Empty food wrappers and a few empty bottles of water. It looked like someone had been living out here for a while. And there, lying on the ground, was a hunting knife. Stuck to the tarp, there were several newspaper clippings about a series of break-ins in the county, all happening around the same time. The sheriff immediately recognized them. He went pale when he saw them and turned to me. "Do you know who this is?" he asked, his voice low. The figure from the night before wasn't just some random person. It was a wanted fugitive, a man who had escaped custody weeks earlier. The sheriff said he had been on the run for a while and no one had been able to find him. Until now. He never came back. The sheriff said they couldn't find him, not even a trace. It was like he'd just disappeared into thin air. I don't know what happened to him, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere. I left that farm the next day, and I don't think I'll ever go back. Every time I think about it, I feel like someone is watching me from the corner of my eye. And every time I see a cornfield now, I remember that figure, standing at the edge of the field, staring at the house, waiting. I'll never forget the first time I noticed something was off with the house. It wasn't immediate, not at first, but as time passed, it became impossible to ignore. My name is Kate. I'm a writer, mostly freelance stuff, articles, short stories, some editing. Nothing too glamorous, but it lets me work from home, which is perfect for me. My husband David works in tech. He's a software developer. His job's the kind of job that requires long hours, but he enjoys it. It gives him a sense of purpose, or so he says. And then there's Emily, our 10-year-old daughter. She's full of energy, always bouncing around, always talking a million miles a minute. We'd been living in a small one-bedroom apartment for years before finally deciding it was time to move. That's when we found the house. It wasn't perfect. What house ever is? It was an old Victorian, one of those grand houses that looked like it belonged in a movie. You know the kind. Tall, narrow, with intricate woodwork and a wraparound porch. The front yard was overgrown with wildflowers, and the backyard was full of old trees that had probably seen better days. It was located in a quiet neighborhood with winding streets and homes spaced far enough apart that we'd have our own little slice of privacy. At first, I was enamored. The house was full of charm. The kind that you can only find in a place that's been standing for over a century. The wooden floors creaked in all the right places. The windows were large, letting in so much natural light. And the rooms... the rooms. There was a parlor with a fireplace that looked like it had been untouched for years, and the kitchen had old-fashioned tiles with intricate patterns. Some were chipped, but I loved them anyway. I could already imagine myself writing in one of the rooms upstairs, staring out the window at the quiet street. We moved in on a Friday. The whole thing was a whirlwind. Boxes everywhere, furniture being shoved into place, Emily running around asking if we could explore the house yet. And explore we did. The first thing that caught my attention, though, was the staircase. It stood at the center of the hallway, grand and imposing, curving up toward the second floor. The staircase was wide, its steps deep and dark, as if the wood had absorbed a century's worth of history. But what I noticed more than anything was the steepness. It was odd, almost unnerving. The angle of the steps made me feel like I was leaning too far forward when I climbed them. I brushed it off at first, maybe it was just the way these old homes were built. But it stuck with me, that steepness. It made the house feel a little less cozy, a little more precarious. Still, we didn't think much of it. That night, we slept in the master bedroom, which was on the first floor. The moonlight spilled through the large windows, casting soft shadows on the walls. The house had a faint, musty smell to it, a mix of dust, old wood, and something earthy. But it didn't bother me. It was the kind of smell that just felt old, like the house had been waiting for us. The first night was quiet, too quiet. The second night, that's when things started to feel strange. It was around midnight when I first heard it. Soft, almost inaudible whispers. It was like a faint rustling in the dark, a voice too low to understand. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it, but it wasn't loud enough to be real. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself, or just the house settling. Houses creak, after all. But then it came again. This time I could hear words, not clear at first, but then they became more distinct. 1, 2, 3, 4. The counting. I sat up in bed, my heart skipping a beat. I could still hear it, the soft murmurs of someone counting the steps, each number spoken in a calm, almost methodical voice, as though whoever was counting wasn't in a hurry. The sound came from somewhere above me, from the direction of the staircase. I turned to David, who was sound asleep next to me. "David," I whispered, shaking him gently. "Do you hear that?" "What's wrong?" he mumbled, barely awake. "Listen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's counting the stairs." He sat up now, his brow furrowed, clearly not sure if I was just imagining it. We both lay there in silence, listening. The counting continued, growing slightly clearer. It was coming from the stairs. I was sure of it. David, always the skeptic, told me it was probably just the house settling. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was the floorboards expanding and contracting, but I knew it wasn't that. The sound was too precise, too deliberate. It wasn't random. It was as if someone who wasn't us was walking up the stairs, counting each step as they went. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept listening, waiting for the counting to stop, but it never did. Eventually, I must have drifted off, but when I woke up the next morning, the memory of it was still fresh in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with those stairs. Over the next few days, the whispers continued. I didn't mention it to David again. I thought maybe I was just imagining things. But then Emily started asking about it. "Mom," she said one afternoon as she was playing with her toys in the living room, "who's counting the steps?" I froze. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "I heard someone counting last night. I couldn't sleep because they were so loud." She paused and looked up at me. Is it a ghost?" I smiled nervously. "No, honey, it's just the house settling. Nothing to worry about." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I stood at the foot of the stairs, watching the darkness. The house was so still. The only sound, the occasional creak of wood or the rustling of trees outside. I was determined to figure out what was going on, so I started to climb slowly. One step, then another. The stairs creaked beneath me, but there was nothing unusual about that. Just the house being old. When I reached the top, I paused. I didn't hear anything. No whispers, no counting. It was as if the house had fallen silent. I turned around, ready to go back down, but then I heard it. 5. The voice was so close, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned, but no one was there. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I looked down the stairs. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there with me. I quickly descended, my feet moving faster than they should have. That was when I first realized it wasn't just the counting. Someone was behind me. I told David about it the next morning, but he brushed it off, telling me I was just tired from all the moving. But I could tell something was off with him too. He was always a little on edge. He started staying up later than usual, working from his laptop in the living room instead of retreating to the office like he used to. He said he couldn't concentrate with the noise from the house, the creaking, the whispering, the counting. One day, I decided to take a good look at the stairs. I'd been so caught up in everything else, I hadn't really taken the time to examine them closely. They were steep, yes, but they weren't crooked or worn down. There were no signs of decay. Still, the steepness felt wrong. My eyes traced the wood grain, the worn patches from years of use. But then, something caught my eye. There, near the bottom, the last step before the landing, there was something odd about it. A slight gap between the wood and the wall, just enough to make you think there was more space there than there should have been. I couldn't stop thinking about that gap. It nagged at me. So one evening, after dinner, I decided to count the steps again. I made my way up slowly, counting each step as I went. 12. There were 12 steps. But when I turned around and started back down, something was wrong. 13. I froze. There were 13 steps going down. I checked again. The last step wasn't right. It was as though the staircase had changed. I went back up, careful this time, counting every step on the way up. 12. Just like before. But when I went down, there was always one more. 13. I was no longer imagining things. I was certain. There was something wrong with those stairs. That night, I refused to use the staircase after dark. David still didn't believe me, of course. He said it was just the layout of the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked past the stairs, I could feel it. Something was waiting for me. Something was always there. I don't know what happened or why it happened, but I stopped using the stairs after dark. David would have to go up and down for me if I needed anything from upstairs. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me every time I stood near that staircase, as though it was alive, as though it had a memory of its own. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I'll hear the whispers again. The counting. Always counting. And I can't help but wonder, how many steps are there really? It was supposed to be a simple favor. Cody was my best friend, and I'd done countless favors for him before. Nothing big, nothing crazy, just the usual stuff, helping him move a couch, picking up some groceries when he was busy, that kind of thing. But this time he asked me for a bigger favor, a favor that ended up turning into something I'll never forget. His dog, Max, had bolted during a walk in the outskirts of town near an old cornfield. Max was always a bit of an escape artist, always running off, chasing squirrels, or anything that caught his attention. So when Cody called me that afternoon and asked for help searching for him, I didn't think twice. The cornfield was just outside the edge of town, beyond the farthest neighborhood. Cody had been walking Max near there when the dog bolted. I'd heard rumors about that field, stories from locals about how strange things happened there. But I didn't really pay much attention to them. It was just a cornfield, right? How could anything bad happen there? I figured it was just a place people let their imaginations run wild, like the kind of stuff you hear at a campfire, only for adults. I arrived at the edge of the field around 6 in the evening. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the golden light made the whole place look like something out of a Western movie. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, but the moment I stepped into the field, I felt an unsettling chill. The temperature hadn't dropped yet, but it was something else, something off. Cody was already walking along the far left side of the field near the tractor path. He waved when he saw me, but he didn't smile. He just looked tired, worn out. I waved back and started walking to the right, deeper into the dense rows of corn. The air felt heavier as I walked further in, like it was pressing down on me, pushing me to hurry. It wasn't just the sound of the corn swaying. It was almost like the wind was carrying whispers, just low enough that I couldn't make them out. The ground beneath me was uneven, the soil dry and cracked in places. My boots crunched with every step, and the scent of earth and decay clung to the air. I could feel the tension growing inside me, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just nerves. I called out for Max a few times, but there was no answer. Not even a bark, not even the faintest rustle in the grass. The silence was starting to feel strange. That's when I heard it. A sound. A quiet shuffling, coming from deeper in the cornfield. I stopped in my tracks, squinting into the sea of yellow-green stalks, trying to see what it was. But I couldn't see anything. The corn was too thick and the shadows were too deep. I called out again, louder this time, but the sound didn't come from the same direction. It was almost as if it was behind me now, just out of sight. I didn't know if it was the wind or if someone was moving through the rows, but I figured I was just being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I started to feel like I was being watched. I was so focused on the sounds that I didn't realize how much further I had gone into the field. The rows of corn seemed to stretch on forever, like they were closing in around me. It was becoming harder to see the edges of the field where I had started. The sun was now sinking fast, and the shadows were long, stretching out in odd angles across the field. That's when I heard it again, closer this time. The sound of shuffling, slow, methodical. I spun around, but no one was there, just the corn, standing tall and unmoving. I tried to calm myself down, but my heart was pounding now. I wasn't sure if it was just nerves or if something really was out there, but either way, I had to keep moving. I decided to push through the field in a straight line, hoping to find a way out. As I walked, my mind raced. What if Max was out here, lost and scared? What if he was hurt? That's when I felt it. A sudden, heavy pressure on my back. It hit so hard, I stumbled forward, landing hard on my chest. I gasped for air, the breath knocked out of me. Before I could even scream, rough hands grabbed me from behind, pulling me up by the arms and slamming me into the dirt again. The air left my lungs in a rush and my vision blurred. I tried to fight back, but my arms were pinned and I couldn't move. Panic surged through me as I struggled, but the hands were too strong. I felt something cold, something sharp, press against my wrist. I looked down in a daze, and that's when I saw the rope, thick and rough, the fibers biting into my skin as it was tied around my wrists. My blood turned cold. Whoever this was, they weren't just trying to scare me. They were planning on keeping me here. Stop. Please. I managed to croak, but the man didn't answer. He just dragged me further into the cornfield, pulling me with surprising strength as I stumbled, unable to keep up. I tried to look up at him, but all I could make out were the outlines of his tattered clothes, the way his face seemed twisted in some strange, half-crazed expression. He muttered to himself as we moved deeper into the field, his words low and garbled like he was talking to someone or something else. I couldn't make out what he was saying at first. It sounded like random nonsense. They don't know. They're stealing from the land, trespassing. I felt like I was drifting in and out of consciousness, the terror mixed with exhaustion. Every step was like dragging my own body through the field, and the air grew heavier with each passing moment. My mind kept screaming at me to escape, but I couldn't. I was too terrified to think straight, too confused to do anything other than obey the man's silent tugging. Finally, he stopped. We had reached a small, makeshift shelter, just a few tarps and blankets slung over branches tucked between the rows of corn. It was dark now, the only light coming from the dim glow of the fading sunset. He shoved me to the ground, and I collapsed, unable to do anything else. He stepped away, muttering more to the corn, as though the plants were listening to him. I felt my stomach twist. My hands were still tied, and I could barely move. I couldn't tell how much time passed, but it felt like an eternity. The man was still talking to himself, sharpening something metallic on a stone with slow, deliberate strokes. I couldn't see the blade clearly, but I could hear the scrape of it against the rock. It was then that I realized something. Cody hadn't come looking for me. He hadn't shouted my name, hadn't called out like I expected. For a second, I was too afraid to think about what that might mean. But deep down, I knew the truth. Cody hadn't noticed. He was too far away, too lost in the field himself. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I couldn't let myself die out here. I was shaking. I didn't know if it was from the cold or from fear, but I knew I had to do something. I had to survive. That's when I heard it. Voices. Distinct, shouting voices. The sound of boots pounding through the dry dirt. I couldn't believe it at first, but then I heard the unmistakable crackle of a radio. "Where is he?" someone shouted. "He's got to be around here somewhere." I couldn't believe it. Help. Actual help. The man's face twisted into a snarl when he heard them, his eyes darting toward the voices. I could feel the tension in the air, like the moment before a storm hits. Before he could react, the flash of a flashlight pierced the dark. The officers had found us. There was a struggle, muffled shouts, and the man was quickly subdued by the police. They untied me, and I collapsed in their arms, overwhelmed with exhaustion. Later, I learned more about the man. He wasn't just some random wanderer. He had been living in the cornfield for months, stealing food, supplies, anything he could find. He had set up a small camp in the heart of the field and had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to wander too close. The police told me I was lucky. If they hadn't found me when they did, I don't know if I would have made it out. As for Max, we never found him. The search went on for a few days, but it was like he had vanished into thin air, as if the field had swallowed him whole. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the cornfield took him, just like it tried to take me. I'll never go back there. I've always been someone who values peace and quiet. Maybe that's why I moved to the small apartment in the first place. Cheap rent, a bit off the beaten path, nestled in a quiet corner of Los Angeles. No fancy amenities, no loud neighbors, just a simple space to call my own. It was perfect, or so I thought. I'd just gotten a new job, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I worked as a copywriter for a small digital marketing firm. My days were filled with the usual: drafting content, proofreading, adjusting websites, and chasing deadlines. It wasn't anything to write home about, but it was steady. I'd just left my last apartment, a cramped, noisy studio in a building that felt like it was falling apart, and I was desperate for some peace. So when I came across this place, a one-bedroom unit tucked behind an old two-story house, I didn't hesitate. The price was right, and the landlord seemed nice enough. His name was Mr. Jensen, and he was an older man, probably in his late 60s. He looked a bit frail, hunched slightly as if the weight of years had worn him down. He spoke slowly, with a dry sense of humor, and when he handed me the keys, I thought, this is it. This is the fresh start I've been looking for. I didn't think to ask too many questions about the apartment's history. Mr. Jensen mentioned that the place had been vacant for a while. The previous tenant had moved out abruptly, though he didn't elaborate on why. I figured it was just one of those things. Everyone had their reasons for moving on. The apartment itself was modest, but it had a certain charm. The hardwood floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored the space, each step echoing in the emptiness. The walls were a faded cream color, and the air smelled faintly of dust and age. The kitchen was small but functional, with a tiny, chipped counter and a refrigerator that hummed loudly in the corner. I remember the living room best. The window overlooked a narrow alley, and sunlight barely filtered through the grime on the glass. The walls were lined with old wooden bookshelves, some empty, others filled with dusty books and knickknacks left behind by previous tenants. In one corner there was a large armchair, an old, worn-out thing with fabric that had long since faded from red to a dull pink. It sat in front of the only light in the room, a small lamp with a cracked shade. There was a cozy, almost melancholic feel to the place, like it was waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. I spent the first few days unpacking, setting up my life in this new space. My job kept me busy during the day, but when I came home at night, I found myself alone with my thoughts. I couldn't help but think about how quiet it was, how still everything felt. The air didn't move, the floorboards didn't creak with every step, and even the street outside seemed muffled as though the world was being held at arm's length. On the third day, I noticed something odd. In the kitchen, mounted on the wall next to the door, was an old-fashioned landline phone. I hadn't noticed it when I first moved in, but there it was, sitting there, its coiled cord draped neatly beside it. The phone looked like it came straight out of the 1980s, beige, with a bulky receiver and a rotary dial that was barely visible through the years of grime that had built up on it. It wasn't plugged into anything, just hanging there on the wall, an odd fixture in an otherwise modern kitchen. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was an old phone, probably left behind by someone, but I didn't see the harm in it. It didn't work after all. When I saw Mr. Jensen later that day, I asked him about it. "Oh, that old thing?" he said, his eyes flicking toward it. "It hasn't been connected for years. No one's used it for a long time. It's just there." His voice trailed off as if he were unsure of how to explain it. "The phone line was disconnected long ago. It's not good for anything. Just a relic, I guess." He chuckled awkwardly, but I could tell he wasn't entirely comfortable talking about it. His eyes darted back to the phone, then quickly back to me, like he was trying to downplay it. Maybe I was imagining it, but something about the way he spoke made me uneasy. Still, I let it go. It was just an old phone. What harm could it do? Days passed and I settled into my routine. Work, home, dinner, repeat. The apartment felt like a sanctuary, a quiet retreat from the chaos of the city. I didn't really expect anything unusual to happen. That was until the first time the phone rang. It was late, around 10 p.m., when I heard the sharp ring of the phone. It was faint at first, as if coming from far away, but there was no mistaking it. The phone on the kitchen wall was ringing. I froze, staring at it. My mind raced. The phone wasn't connected. It couldn't be ringing. I got up slowly and walked to the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The phone was just sitting there, still hanging on the wall. The cord swayed slightly, almost as if it had been moved by someone, but I hadn't heard any footsteps. There was no one there. I waited for the sound to stop, but it rang again. One single, crisp ring. And then, silence. I stood there for a long time, not sure what to do. My eyes kept drifting back to the phone. Was I hearing things? I had to be. I shrugged it off, convinced it was just a figment of my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night, it rang again. This time, I walked over to it. I didn't pick it up, but I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. The phone rang once more. I stared at it, and then, finally, I turned and left the kitchen, unable to explain what had just happened. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the phone. Every time I heard a creak in the floor, I wondered if it was the sound of someone moving toward it. The ringing became a nightly occurrence. Every few hours, I would hear it. It didn't matter if I was in the kitchen, the bedroom, or the living room. It always seemed to come from the wall. But no one was ever on the other end. No voice. No explanation. It wasn't until one night, about a week after the first ring, that I finally did something I'd been avoiding. I answered the phone. The receiver felt cold in my hand as I picked it up. The line crackled with static, but there was no dial tone. I brought the receiver to my ear and held my breath. At first, I thought I'd heard something, just a whisper, maybe, but then it became clear. Breathing. Slow, steady, and too familiar. It was my own breath. I pulled the phone away, my pulse racing, my skin crawling. But the breathing didn't stop. I could still hear it, echoing in my ears, my own shallow gasps, like I was standing there in the room, listening to myself. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't explain it. I slammed the receiver down, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was going on? The days that followed were filled with tension. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. The phone would ring, always once, always in the dead of night. And when I answered, there would only be breathing. It was as if something or someone was waiting for me to pick up. I started to feel paranoid, like I was being watched. The apartment, which had once felt like a peaceful retreat, now felt like a trap. One night, the whispers began. I had just finished dinner, and as I was cleaning up, the phone rang again. My hands trembled as I reached for the receiver, but this time the whispers were different. They were low, muffled, and indistinct, like a conversation just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were coming from the phone. Then, just as I thought I heard something familiar, I swore I heard my name. I dropped the phone, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I just heard. Was I losing my mind? Why was this happening? The next night, it happened again, only this time the whispers were coming from everywhere. They filled the apartment, not just the phone. I could hear them in the kitchen, in the living room, behind the door to the bathroom. There were whispers in the walls, in the corners of the ceiling. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if someone was desperate to get my attention. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things, left the apartment in the middle of the night, and never looked back. I moved out of Los Angeles completely, to a small town up north where I thought I'd be safe. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, or the silence in my new place is too thick, I hear it. A faint ring coming from somewhere far away. And I wonder if the phone ever stopped ringing at all. I never thought I'd end up in a house like this. In fact, when I first moved to California, I wasn't exactly planning on buying a house. I'd always been the kind of person who bounced from apartment to apartment, never really putting down roots anywhere. But this time was different. I had a good job offer, an office position at a small marketing firm in Santa Monica, and I figured maybe it was time to settle down, start fresh. The job was everything I needed at the time. It was comfortable, low stress, and paid just enough for me to live relatively worry-free. I didn't have to think about bills too much. But living in an apartment meant constantly dealing with noisy neighbors and the cramped feeling that came from having to share a space with others. I wanted something that was mine, even if it meant taking on a mortgage. I didn't mind the idea of having a place to call my own, as long as it was close enough to work and didn't cost an arm and a leg. That's when I found this house, a small 2-story home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Los Angeles. It was built in the 1960s, with a few quirky details that made it stand out. The hardwood floors had seen better days, and the walls were painted a soft shade of yellow that probably used to be bright and inviting, but now felt a little dingy. Still, it had potential. And when I walked through the door, I could feel the history of the place. It had the kind of charm that older homes have, those beautiful oak beams that ran across the ceilings, built-in bookshelves lining the living room walls, and a grand fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was definitely a fixer-upper, but I figured a coat of paint and some new furniture would do wonders. I moved in on a Friday after signing all the paperwork and getting the keys. The first few days were filled with the usual chaos of unpacking, boxes everywhere, furniture scattered around, and me trying to figure out where to put all my things. I was excited, but there was a sense of unease lingering in the back of my mind. I had lived in enough places to know that no house was perfect, but something about this place just felt off. It wasn't the house itself, necessarily. It was more of a feeling I couldn't shake. The first night I went to bed exhausted. I'd had a long day of hauling boxes and arranging furniture, and I was more than ready to crash. I had my dog Lucy with me, my golden retriever who had been my companion for years. She was as sweet as they come, gentle but always protective when something felt wrong. She didn't seem to mind the house at first, but I noticed that when we were both alone in the evening, she would get a little jumpy. She'd stare at the hallway and pace around, like she was hearing something I couldn't. But the real trouble started the next day. I was putting some of my kitchen stuff away when I first noticed the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was definitely there. An earthy scent, like wet soil, mixed with something faintly sweet. At first, I thought maybe it was just old wood, or perhaps the house had been sitting empty for too long before I moved in. I shrugged it off and opened a few windows, thinking the fresh air would help. But when the sun started to set and the temperature dropped, the smell got worse. I remember it so clearly. By the time I had finished unpacking, it was dark outside, and the house felt colder, even though I had the heat running. The smell was stronger now, more pervasive. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was persistent, like something was hiding just out of sight, and no matter how much I opened the windows, it wouldn't go away. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but there was definitely one room where it seemed worse. The room at the end of the hallway. It was an odd room, almost like a forgotten space. The door was slightly off-center from the rest of the rooms, and when I first looked inside, I could see faded floral wallpaper peeling off the walls. The floors were covered in an old carpet, stained in places from years of wear. It didn't look like a room anyone had used in a while, but it wasn't the kind of room I was eager to spend time in anyway. When I opened the door to air it out, the smell immediately hit me. It was subtle at first, but strong enough to make my stomach turn. The earthy scent was now mixed with something faintly sour, almost like something had been left out in the sun for too long. I figured it was just mold, maybe some old water damage from years ago. The house was old after all, no big deal. Still, there was something about it, something off. The air in that room felt thick, almost heavy. It wasn't like other rooms in the house. When I stepped in, the floor creaked under my weight. The walls felt closer than they should have, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than usual. I decided to just leave it alone for the time being. There were plenty of other things to do, and I didn't want to get too fixated on a room that hadn't seen any use in years. That night, Lucy started acting strange. She had always been calm around the house, but now she wouldn't stop pacing. She wouldn't sleep, just kept walking in circles, her eyes fixed on the hallway. At one point, she stood at the end of the hall, her tail tucked between her legs, staring at the door of the room at the end of the hall. She was completely still, like she was waiting for something. I called her over to me, but she refused to move. That's when I started to get nervous. I mean, dogs don't act like that without reason, right? "Lucy, come on," I said gently, trying to coax her to the living room with me. But she just kept staring at the door, her body tense. I thought maybe it was just the smell making her uneasy. Maybe it was affecting me more than I realized, too. The next few days were a blur of more unpacking and cleaning, but each time I entered that room, the smell seemed to get worse. I tried everything, opened all the windows, sprayed air freshener, even lit candles, but nothing helped. The smell was always there, lurking in the corners of that room, making the air feel stagnant. It wasn't just the room, though. It started to feel like the entire hallway was affected, like the house itself was somehow holding on to it. Lucy refused to go anywhere near that room. Even when I tried to take her out the back door, she'd go out of her way to avoid the hallway entirely, almost as if she was terrified of something. It wasn't like her. She was normally so easygoing, but this different. A week after I moved in, I started noticing other things. Little things. A flicker of light in the corner of my eye, The sound of something scraping against the floorboards at night, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But it wasn't until that one night, late at night, 2 a.m., that everything escalated. I was just about to fall asleep when the smell hit me again, stronger than ever. It was so overwhelming that I woke up, sitting straight up in bed, gasping for air like I'd just run a marathon. My throat burned, my eyes stung, and then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched scraping sound coming from the hallway. I froze, unable to move, my breath shallow. Lucy was up now too, sitting at the edge of the bed, her body stiff. She was staring at the door, growling softly. It wasn't like her at all to growl unless she sensed danger. The sound of scraping continued. I knew it was coming from that room. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I had to go see what was in that room. But as soon as I stood up, Lucy barked sharply, her voice desperate, as if pleading with me not to go. My stomach twisted with dread, but I couldn't stop myself. Something in me urged me to open that door. I walked down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to the room was slightly ajar, as it had been before. The air around it felt thick, almost suffocating, like the house was holding its breath. When I opened the door fully, the smell slammed into me like a punch to the gut. My eyes watered, and I immediately gagged. The room was shrouded in darkness, but I could still make out the outlines of the old furniture. A dusty armchair, a small side table with a lamp that hadn't worked in years, and the faded wallpaper that had been peeling away from the walls. But there was something else now. Something I hadn't seen before. Near the center of the room, the carpet was disturbed. It was as if something had been moved underneath it, pushing the fibers out of place. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slowly bent down to pull back the carpet. Beneath it, the floorboards were scratched and dented, gouged as if something been trapped there for a long time. My fingers trembled as I touched the wood, feeling the deep indentations. The smell was unbearable now, mixing with something else, something metallic, almost like blood. I don't know why I kept pulling at the floorboards. Maybe it was because I had to know what was underneath, or maybe it was because I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been trapped there for far too long. When I finally managed to pry up a few of the boards, I found a small hole. It was filled with dirt, clumpy, wet, and thick. But there was something more, something alive. My hands shook as I stumbled back, my breath ragged in my chest. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew I had to get out of that room. I grabbed Lucy, who was now trembling beside me, and I slammed the door shut. I didn't know what had been hidden under that floor, but I knew I'd never go near it again. I haven't been back inside the house since that night. I can't. The smell still lingers in my mind, faint but persistent. It's been weeks, and every time I close my eyes, I see that hole in the floor, and I can't help but wonder what was buried under there, and why was it trying to get out? That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.